Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Geopolitics and Class Struggle with Eddie Liger. Another day, another stream. I'm excited for today's stream. I might sound a little tired today, and I apologize for that if I do, because I had to do homework for about 100 hours tonight, and it destroyed me. I'm going to unbutton this. But I'm still alive. I'm still kicking. I still got enough energy to discuss Lenin's Imperialism, Chapter 1 at least, and maybe some news and politics if we have time for that. So, a while back, I did a reading guide of Lenin's Imperialism, and it's been really popular. One of the most popular playlists on our channel, and definitely the most popular reading guide. I'm going to pull it up here because I want to show it so people can check it out if they so desire.
I'm absolutely pumped about this.
But yeah, as you can see, I was living in a different house at the time. We did not have as good of a camera or as good of a microphone as we have now. I've actually upgraded the microphone twice since then. I also had a Bang energy drink in front of me and a Nintendo Switch and a stuffed dog in the background. So there's that too. Hello, everyone. Hey, Jimmy. Good way to finish up my work tonight. Yay. 100 hours is crazy. It wasn't actually 100 hours. It was like It was like 7 or 8 hours. Jeez. No wonder my brain is fried. What's up, everyone? But anyways, this was one of my favorite video series that I've ever done. But I've always wanted to go back and kind of redo it or give it a rerun. Because I had read Marx's Capital at one point before doing that reading guide for Lenin's Imperialism. But I didn't really understand it. I didn't really grasp it. And imperialism made a lot of sense to me. But obviously, the work of Lenin and Lenin's imperialism especially is based on the work of Karl Marx and the groundwork laid by Marx. So now that I've read a lot more of that, reread Capital, and almost finished with Volume 2 here, I feel like I have a better understanding of imperialism, although I thought there would be more, at least in Chapter 1. I thought there would be more where I was like, oh, I misunderstood it the last time I did the reading guide. But I didn't find too much of that because Lenin writes so succinctly and so concisely and is able to bring out what's important really well. So, yeah. Actually, I'm gonna skip the preface, although maybe I shouldn't have. I usually don't skip the preface. But I'm going to this time and go straight to the introduction, which says that with the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which the Spanish-American War was the U.S. seizing a bunch of colonies in Latin America, and the Anglo-Boer War was the British Empire seizing a bunch of territories in southern Africa. Capitalism reached its imperialist stage, the latest stage of capitalist development. It reaches a new era called imperialism. And there are a lot of great analyses of imperialism from reformist Marxists and economists like Kautsky and the English economist J.A. Hobson, who analyzed the principal political and economic features of capitalism, talk about what characterizes this era of imperialism. Sorry, I meant to say capitalist imperialism, not just capitalism that they talk about. So here you see Lenin drawing from reformists and even bourgeois right-wing pro-capitalist economists, just as we do today, because you can learn a lot of things, even from people you disagree with, especially when you live under capitalism and there's going to be a bunch of bourgeois economists running around. So there's another good book by the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hinferding called Finance Capital, which gives a good theoretical analysis, although Lenin says he's confused about the theory of money. Again, we see how this is based on the work of Marx and Marx's Capital. So most of Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is going to focus on economics rather than politics. Although he says the political analysis is equally important, And that's sort of like what Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets is. It's an economic analysis for sure. It involves economic analysis, but it's mostly about the development of the political systems that support the imperialist stage of capitalism over the last 100 years or so, since Lenin, actually. And then Lenin also mentions that pacifism is not what he's supporting here. Imperialism is not just violence, or violence by the government, violence by the state in the abstract, or violent foreign policy abstractly. Right? Imperialism is a stage of development of capitalism. It is capitalism in its monopoly stage, when the capitalists go abroad and use violence to expand their markets, use economic warfare, and attempt to control the political systems of other countries in order to carry out their economic interests or best serve their economic interests. So that's what Lenin's going to be talking about here, and that's the end of the introduction. Then it moves on to chapter 1, the concentration of production. So Lenin talks about this enormous growth of industry that's come about since Marx wrote Capital in 1867, since he died in 1883, and even in the last few years leading up to 1917. So Marx says that the concentration of production into increasingly larger enterprises is a characteristic feature of capitalism. That the firms which dominate capitalism, the manufacturing factories and the companies controlled by capitalists, are going to merge together and concentrate and form into large-scale industries, rather than smaller firms producing less commodities at a time. And with the Industrial Revolution, Marx really saw the explosion of large-scale industry, rather than smaller-scale artisans or manufacturers. So labor becomes more productive in the era of large-scale industry, and production becomes concentrated more intensely than workers become concentrated, which means there's more fixed capital, there's more machines, there's more factories rather than manual labor, which we'll discuss later. So Lenin goes over a bunch of statistics in the early 1900s that show how large-scale industry in Germany and the U.S. were coming to dominate production and employment. And, they also dominate energy usage. The vast majority of power in society, or that's utilized by society, is utilized by large-scale industry, by giant monopolies and huge concentrated companies, which now has a lot of implications for climate change, right? Because the economy is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. And because shareholders and syndicates, cartels, trusts, monopolies, investment groups like BlackRock and Vanguard completely control production and the use of energy, there's not much that the working masses who are affected by climate change can do about it. So the U.S. at this time, in the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s, is the fastest growing, the fastest concentrating economy. In 1904, there are 1,900 large-scale industries, and then 5 years later, in 1909, there's over 3,000. So the development of concentration in the early stages of capitalism leads to the development of monopoly later on, meaning the concentration of factories and labor into the cities. And like I said, the displacement of smaller artisans, handicraft workers and manufacturers by giant large-scale factories is what lays the basis for monopoly. So those large-scale factories at first are still based on free competition in the market, but later they'll come to dominate the market, and those large-scale industries, like I said, are the material base of monopolies that form. So this is the dialectical transformation of competition into monopoly. So competition in the free market over time develops into its opposite, monopoly and the domination of markets. And Lenin says that this is one of the most important developments in the capitalist mode of production. So there are different successive production processes and different branches of industry that begin to be combined as monopolies and conglomerates are formed. So you have production processes that were previously performed successively that are now being performed under the supervision of one firm or one conglomerate. who organize successive labor processes to happen all at once under their eye. So, for example, you have the smelting of iron, which at one point was its own industry, its own. There were capitalist firms who would just do the smelting of iron and then sell that iron to somebody who smelts it into steel. And then the person who smelts it into steel, or the large scale industry factory that smelts it into steel, would give it to somebody who turns that steel into a product, which they then sell. But now, as these steel conglomerates and syndicates are forming, they combine the smelting of iron, the smelting of steel, and the crafting into steel products all within one building, or, if not within one building, within a handful of buildings that are all controlled by the same shareholders, all controlled by the same capitalists, who often also control the ports or the railroads or the roads and the trucks that transport these goods back and forth. So you see, as production is concentrated, the ownership of production is also concentrated at the top. So there's a bourgeois or pro-capitalist economist called Hans Gideon Heyman, who actually admits that Marx's theory of concentration is proved true by the coalition of coal and steel companies forming into syndicates or conglomerates, and closely allying with one another, and both being financed by the big banks. So we also have the role of banks, the role of finance capital here in supporting these conglomerates and helping them merger together. But the next chapter is the one that's going to focus on banks more heavily. So we'll get more into that later. But like I said, these conglomerates and trusts who are controlling the production of raw materials and the processes that turn those raw materials into products and sell them also are coming to control the means of transportation, rail and ports, and the means of production used to transport their goods, as well as those used to produce their goods. And they're also the production of raw materials and the manufacturing of goods are coming to be controlled by, the same conglomerates. So there are some people already in Lenin's day who are arguing the argument that's more common today, that it's not capitalism that leads to imperialism, right? Because capitalism is characterized by free competition. It's actually crony capitalism or government intervention, and real capitalism would be capitalism based on free competition. And this has never been true. Free competition, like we said, is a fundamental principle of capitalism, but over time it develops into its opposite, monopoly. So capitalism itself is destined to become monopoly. So Lenin shows how monopoly was accelerated by state intervention in Germany, but it also happened in the English economy, which was more based on free trade and free markets. So regardless of the state intervening, free competition develops into monopoly. Sometimes the monopolies or the large-scale industry capitalists or the corporations come to control the government, though, and use the government to accelerate their concentration. So that just accelerates the process. So as monopolies and cartels and syndicates and combines, trusts form, the barrier to entry in the market increases. So other companies or other capitalists who want to get involved in a market need to pay, or the entry to that market, the cost of the productive capital needed to produce goods for that market increases with the formation of these combines. Because in order to compete with them, you have to produce just an insane quantity of goods, because they're based on large scale industry. They can produce so much at once, and they're financed by the banks, that it becomes really, really hard to compete with them in this market or even enter the market. So Lenin says that Marx predicted concentration and monopoly, which economists in his day are now accepting. But a lot of those same economists say Marxism is refuted, despite accepting his theory of concentration. And they do this with a lot of his breakthroughs, just accepting them, but never crediting him. And Lenin calls this a conspiracy of silence. And we still see this today, where people acknowledge the theories of Marx have been proven correct, or, the core of the theories. And, they accept them, but they don't give Marx credit, or, sometimes they'll even slap a new name on something that Marx realized 200 years ago, and try and make it into a theory of their own. That's kind of the nature of the academy. You're always going to have stuff like that, the capitalist academy. And Lenin says, these economists can try and discredit Marx through a conspiracy of silence, but facts are a stubborn thing, and they have to be reckoned with whether we like it or not. So Lenin is basically saying facts don't care about your feelings there. And he cites Ben Shapiro, of course. Just kidding. But free trade was taken as a given by the economists in Marx's day. At the time, there were only an isolated few monopolies, but they began to develop more and more with boom-bust cycles and with technology. So, of course, capitalism is prone to crises, and after an economic crash, after an economic crisis, there's a mass investment of capital and flooding of capital to the market. So these boom cycles are times when concentration greatly increases and cartels, syndicates, and monopolies are able to form. Another characteristic of monopolization is that it allows companies to drive prices higher, higher than the value of labor as measured in labor time. And Paul Cockshott talks about this some when he's discussing the correlation between labor time and price. So monopolization and concentration seizes more and more industries with time, and eventually free competition is systematically removed. And this happens at really the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century. That's when capitalism qualitatively changes and reaches its imperialist monopoly stage, leaving behind the free competition stage. And Lenin breaks down the development of monopoly capitalism and imperialism into a handful of stages, beginning between 1860 and 1870. Like when I said, Marx published Capital in 1867. So Marx is looking at this stage of free competition. But after 1867, monopolies start to develop. There's only a few of them, and they're isolated, and they don't control the economy by 1870, but there are a few of them. And large-scale industry has developed. The basis for what would later become monopoly capitalism had already developed. So monopoly capitalism, imperialism was in its embryonic stage, its very earliest developments. There's then an economic crisis in 1873. We see the development of a lot more cartels. Now, a lot of these don't last. A lot of them aren't very durable. They're transitory. But we do see the development of more and more of them, and we see increasing concentration and monopolization during times of crisis. So at the end of the 19th century, 1890 and onward, and at the very beginning of the 20th century, we see cartels become the foundation of economic life. There's a lot of crises at the end of the 19th century that allow for this to happen. And we see the rise of monopolies backed by the big banks really take over at the turn of the century. And it becomes, like I said, the basis of economic life. Most markets and industries are now dominated by cartels and monopolies. Capitalism has qualitatively transformed into imperialism, a new stage out of the stage of free competition. And at this time, Standard Oil is founded in the U.S. In 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. I feel like that's pretty symbolic. We always learn about, the giant steel and oil monopolies in the early 1900s in history class. And this is when Lenin's saying is exactly when capitalism qualitatively transformed into its stage of imperialism. So the magnitude of output and technology makes these cartels like Standard Oil dominant over competition and just allows them to grow bigger and bigger. They pay out huge dividends to their shareholders, just as they do today. And this comes with the transition away from manual labor and towards more machine labor. Like I said, the productivity of labor increases. So machines allow a lot more to be produced with a lot less labor. So the concentration of these monopolies comes with concentration of machine labor and less manual labor. Humans are essentially just cogs that keep the machine processes going. So we also see at this time the intellectual property regime begins. Companies, monopolies, cartels, and banks start buying up patents so that they can stop competitors from producing products that will compete with their own. Strategic patent buyouts begin to happen. Of course, you can only do this if you're one of the richest companies, if you're one of the dominant ones. This is still how it works today. I was talking to one of my engineering buddies this weekend a lot about what he does at work. And a fair amount of what he does is just reading through patents, understanding patents, and trying to work around patents in order to make things that are useful. And it just seems like a huge hassle. It's hugely inconvenient to the development of production and the advancement of production and human technology, because he constantly has to work around these patents that are owned by other companies, owned by other engineering companies, if he wants to make something cool and new with a new function or an improved function. So if there's like a circular nut, he'll have to make his nut like a triangle, even if it's inconvenient to do so because some other company owns the patent on the circular nut. It sounded really frustrating, but it's interesting that Lenin is talking about this in 1917. It's still the case of today. So Lenin also looks at the concentration of German chemical companies like Bayer and Hoechst. I don't know. My German's not very good, y'all. But these are what I talk about in the Journal of American Socialist Studies 2, which you can get at midwesternmarks.com in the book section on ebook or paperback. You can see it up there on the bookshelf, right there, the black journal at the top. I talk about the development of the pharmaceutical industry and the development of for-profit capitalist healthcare, and what the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical monopolies actually develop out of is these German chemical companies, Bayer and Hoechst being Hoechst, Hochst is how you pronounce that. And there's a little mark, a little grammar mark that I don't know what it is above the O. Clearly my German is really good. Either way, these German chemical companies develop into these giant pharmaceutical companies that dominate the industry. And, in modern day, in the last 20 years, created the opioid crisis by controlling academic institutions, controlling the media, controlling political NGOs, and using that to push opioids on people and attack anybody who criticized the expansion of opioid prescriptions to make a profit as being opiophobic, literally. So we also see the concentration of production in the modern day of intellectual production, of the production of information. Media and academic institutions that produce the information people consume are also controlled by these large monopolies and trusts. And in the case of the German chemical companies, the same trust that Lenin is watching concentrate in 1917, which forms the basis for later monopolies. And nowadays, these trusts are also tied together by investment groups. You have like Vanguard and BlackRock, which are just coalitions of shareholders, super wealthy shareholders that are paid dividends through these investment groups. And it allows them to remain more anonymous and just more easily divide up the booty and divide up markets between the largest capitalists in the country, or on London and Wall Street, at least. So at this time, there's increased collaboration at this time, meaning in Lenin's time, there's increased collaboration between monopolized companies who divide the market between themselves, as we were just talking about, and there are new methods of doing this today, like the investment groups. Production becomes increasingly cooperative, concentrated, and therefore social, but appropriation remains private. So we said that large-scale industry and the concentration of production itself is the basis, the material basis that allows monopolies to grow. So you see the concentration of production, the move of production towards cooperation and large-scale industry in these factories, which produces an insane amount of wealth, but all that wealth is appropriated by capitalists at the top, by the shareholders who control these cartels. So production becomes social, but ownership and appropriation of the products or of the value created in production remains private. And social production remains the private property of extremely wealthy individuals. So at this point, you see a move away from commercial activity and towards speculative activity, like Wall Street speculators that I'm sure we've all heard of. People who buy up stock that they think is going to grow and profit over the next few years in the future. and then they sell that stock when it's high, sell that stock when it's more valuable, and try and make money that way. And this becomes the most successful capitalists are now Wall Street speculators, people who are good at predicting how the economy is going to move and buying and selling stocks, rather than people who are able to produce a product or an innovation that others find valuable, or that allows them to produce more than competitors in the market. So capitalism in its monopoly stage, in its imperialist stage, rewards technological innovation less and less, and comes to reward speculation and the manipulation of stocks and shares a lot more. And of course, we've seen that today. The U.S. has basically become entirely financialized. All of the country's wealth and ownership of the means of production has been concentrated into the hands of an incredibly small amount of capitalists, of Wall Street shareholders, and some shareholders in London and the UK, like I said, who just control everything from agriculture to the service industry, regular industry. They're connected to the banks. So these are all speculators, people who are really good at gaming the stock market in order to increase their own wealth. So the companies that are able to monopolize the fastest, or the industries that monopolize the fastest, are those which capture raw materials first, the production of raw materials first. So say if I'm a capitalist, or, and I own a large scale industry factory that produces steel products, manufactured steel products. And then I come to control a steel mine, in the area just 5 miles away. I'm going to be able to develop into a monopoly very fast. The production of raw materials, the extractive industries, the production of coal, oil, and other energy sources by capitalists involved in industry and connected to the banks is what allows monopolization to happen very quickly. And this happens faster in some industries rather than others. In industries where the nature of production in that industry makes it easier for the capitalist to capture the sources of raw materials. It can get a little complex, but it's actually not that complicated if you just think about it. So back then there were bourgeois economists saying that cartels and monopolies could abolish crises. Obviously this was wrong. Monopolies actually make crises worse and more frequent a lot of the times. And remember that with crises, with the boom bust cycles, concentration increases. The concentration of capital does. So crises create concentration. Concentration creates crises, and they increase and lead to each other. So yeah, that's the end of chapter 1, the concentration of production. Next time we're going to go on to chapter 2, which is the new role of the banks. So like I said, as industry is growing and concentration is increasing, all these cartels and syndicates and monopolies that are forming are also being backed by the banks. They're being financed by the banks, and that leads to a huge acceleration of concentration and monopolization. So the banks are very important. And Lenin says at the end of chapter 1, we can't have a full understanding of the growth of monopolies, of the transition of capitalism from its free competition stage into its imperialist stage, that qualitative transformation, unless we understand the role of the banks in facilitating the easier investment of capital, and the role of the banks in financing the growth, development, and concentration of industry. It's not just the industrial capitalists, it's the merger of the industrial capitalists with the finance capitalists, with the bankers, that leads capitalism to transform to its imperialist stage. So that's what we'll talk about next time. But I hope you enjoyed chapter 1. This is one of my favorite books. It is my favorite book, actually. I think I've said that before a handful of times. So I'm glad to cover it again. I'm glad to rerun over this reading guide that I did so long ago, in better quality, hopefully, and with a lot more knowledge in my noggin. So yeah, I hope y'all are looking forward to chapter 2, the new role of the banks. I have to go get a glass of water. So I'm going to play something for y'all to watch while I go do that. Let's see. What do the people want? Roman Bravo Young got spladled. What? Sorry, I'm trying to find a good YouTube video. I don't know if y'all watched this match. I ended up losing this one, but it was a good match. This guy's like BRB.
And we're just underway here. Another 72-kilo quarterfinal bout. That's Michael Hooker with the Army WCAP program in the red. In the blue, Eddie Smith, Pickaxe Wrestling Club. Got a Dubuque singlet on. Dubuque, the university in Iowa, pretty sure. Nothing to do with the coach at Princeton University. Pretty sure, anyway. Arm spin attempt.
Arm spin attempt from Smith. I didn't even realize this match was commentated. Need to watch that sometime and hear what they have to say about me. Eddie Smith runs a communist website, MidwesternMarks.com. One of the only Greco wrestlers to do that this year. We think he should go compete for the Soviet Union if he loves socialism so much. Leave America. Such great content. I went to SIU Carbondale as well. Very cool. Very cool. That's where Carlos teaches. For those who don't know. Good old Iowa, you bet. Thanks, comrade. You bet. Where can we get a copy of the reading guide? Well, I will publish all episodes of the reading guide on the YouTube, right? So right now I'm doing a live stream, but I will cut that into a clip, edit it a little bit, and upload it on our YouTube channel, Midwestern Marks, which obviously you're aware of. There's no, I just deleted the text version, the script for my reading guide, which maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have saved it for you all. But if you want to see the other reading guide, the previous one, send it to you. So the original reading guide is just a playlist on our YouTube channel that I did 2 years ago. But the first episode has 11,000 views. Wow. I guess that was when we had a TikTok account with 400,000 followers who we could send our content to. But G.I. Joe has been found dead in Miami. Rest in peace. I heard they threw chairs at him like Juan Guaido, but one of them caught him in the eyeball. He died. True story. True story. Man, it was crazy. One of the most interesting things, I think, in rereading chapter 1 of Imperialism, like I said, there wasn't too much where I was like, now my understanding of this has changed years later, except for, of course, the part where he's talking about the concentration of the German chemical companies, which I looked at in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, right up there, because that led to the transformation into the monopolistic pharmaceutical industry of today. That was the material and economic basis that allowed for that to come about. Because in World War II, they were basically producing Adderall, which they called pep pills. They were giving to soldiers to keep them going and give them energy on the battlefield. But there were also, I can't remember what it was, like penicillin was one of them. And there was another antibiotic that was super valuable in World War II. And these chemical companies just started mass producing them, which led to their further concentration, which was an example of state intervention that accelerated concentration, which Lenin was talking about. And then they needed to keep those profits high after the end of the war. So they kept producing penicillin and trying to develop other medicines that could treat illnesses. And you have the formation, the emergence of the modern pharmaceutical industry. Now, the way that they've tried to keep profits high and expand profits and expand markets, which we know every capitalist firm and monopoly has to do, or they'll go under. A lot of the methods they've used to do so have been terrible, which is why I go in depth looking at the opioid crisis in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which, as I said, you can buy on midwesternmarks.com in ebook or print format in the books section. I go in deep on the opioid crisis because the concentration of these monopolies and these pharmaceutical companies into cartels and syndicates allows for them to control academic institutions, allows for them to control and influence the media. And they portray, not only do they market to consumers these opioid crisis, or I'm stumbling over my words. Not only do they market to consumers these opioid commodities, but they market them to physicians, they market them to nurses, they market them to providers. And they use the media to call anybody who's critical of this opiophobic and, not compassionate towards patients because you want to take their painkillers away. This was the message that was systematically disseminated by the pharmaceutical monopolies. And now we have 100,000 people a year who die of overdose death, which began with pharmaceutical opioids, began with painkillers that people were prescribed by their doctor and that they got legally from a pharmacy. Eventually you get addicted, you run out of money, you can't pay, and then you switch to cheaper alternatives, which are usually street drugs like heroin or fentanyl, which right now constitutes 60,000 deaths a year. The number one killer in the U.S. when it comes to overdose and drug addiction and the opioid crisis specifically. So the concentration of the chemical companies that Lenin's looking at in 1917 is what creates the basis for the pharmaceutical companies who would create the opioid crisis today. And it's just a further concentration of control of the means of production. Like I said, they control intellectual production. They control the academy. They control the media as well. They are able to spend millions and millions of dollars in the surplus that they make every year on marketing to providers as well as consumers. So, and the opioid crisis also coincided with this qualitative shift in healthcare. This is the Journal of American Socialist Studies, by the way. I don't know if I sent it already. I did. There's a qualitative shift in healthcare where opioids are no longer prescribed to people who are in immense pain, recovering from surgery or some kind of traumatic, horrible injury, but they are now prescribed for pain and anxiety. So there's this qualitative shift that happens because of the marketing campaign and because of the influence campaign launched by companies like Purdue Pharma, controlled by shareholders like the Sackler family, collecting millions of dollars in shareholder dividends from these companies. That leads to the qualitative shift in healthcare, which is the prescription of opioids for pain and anxiety, minor pain and anxiety, which leads to these high rates of addiction. There's so many people struggling with this silently today too. People who aren't, people who don't fall into building up a tolerance, looking for more painkillers, looking for more prescriptions, and then eventually falling back on street drugs. There are a lot of people who are just hooked on the opioids that they were prescribed initially, and still battling with that, and still hooked on buying these from the pharmaceutical companies. I have a friend whose dad, was prescribed opioids when this was all first kicking off, when these companies like Purdue Pharma were marketing opioids to the providers, and the providers first started prescribing them in mass and pushing them as if they were 100% safe and there were no risks. They prescribed my buddy's dad this insane amount of opioids, this insane dosage. And then the next doctor he went to years later, after he found himself hooked on those, told him, this is insane. I can't believe this doctor prescribed this to you. But especially at first, when these producers of information connected to Purdue Pharma and the pharmaceutical industry started pushing opioids. They were saying they're 100% safe. There's no risks. We have this new miracle drug that takes away the pain of your patients and the symptoms of your patients. And there's another aspect of this too. The fact that capitalism makes people sick. There's a really good book called The Second Sickness by Howard Waitskin, which talks about the way that capitalism isolates people. Capitalism destroys people's health. Capitalism makes people exhausted. And then they turn to the healthcare system, which can't always fix these problems, right? Which can't give people food and more time off and more rest, or, childcare, or whatever would actually make them more healthy, actually bring more health and happiness into their life. So it leads to a struggle on the doctor's end, where the doctor is looking at their patients, and their patients are suffering, and they know they're suffering, but they have no real way to fix them, right? There's no disease that you can pinpoint and say, we're going to attack this with a certain antibiotic, right? Because a lot of the health issues stem from capitalism and stem from exploitation, things that can't be fixed unless we change the system. So opioid commodities allow doctors to give their patients something that makes them feel better, right? Gets the patients to stop coming in and stop complaining about issues that may be caused from social isolation or capitalist exploitation or poverty, right? They take the opioid and they just feel better about all these issues, and then they won't keep coming back into the doctor, and that makes the doctor feel good. We did it. We successfully cured this patient's depression. Or successfully cured this patient's health. But of course, you're just masking the symptoms, which is a lot of what the modern pharmaceutical industry does, is just mask symptoms, which many times stem directly from capitalism. So yeah, that's another aspect that has led to the opioid crisis. Great stream, Comrade Eddie. Have you or Midwestern Marks had Radhika Desai on yet? Would you be great to interview her in her book about capitalism, coronavirus, and war? Yes, we have interviewed her. We actually interviewed her about that book. Funny you ask her. We asked her about that book. It wasn't specifically about that book, maybe. And I was planning on also writing a review of that book. I believe she asked me to as well. I believe her and Alan Freeman reached out and asked if I'd write a review, or if someone from Midwestern Marks would, and I stepped up because I love Radhika's work. She was instrumental in helping me understand capital, instrumental in helping me understand Marxist economics, helping me deconstruct the confusion that I had from neoclassical economics. So yeah, right now I'm sending the interview we did with her. It was actually, we did, like I said, touched on her book, but it was about Marx's crisis theories. So Marx wanted to write a volume of Capital that he never got around to, specifically about crises and the different kinds of crises, how they're caused. But he died just before he was able to do it. And Engels died before he was able to, do his own version of it. So that's basically what Radhika does, is lay out all the different kinds of crises systematically here based on the work of Marx, based on the theoretical foundation of Marx, and explains it in this video. So it's actually, definitely one of my favorite videos. Definitely one of my favorite interviews that we've done. So check that out if you are interested in all that. Radhika is solid. I agree. I miss your TikTok videos. I'm sorry, but everyone just needs to get off TikTok. It's a dopamine trap. It's bad for your brain. It distracts you from reading. You just got to pick up Lenin's Imperialism, and it's more entertaining than TikTok will ever be, and rewarding. Hey, Eddie, infographics, propaganda piece on Comrade Stalin. Didn't I already do that one? I think I already did infographics on Stalin. I think it was a really popular one. Is it the Cold War oversimplified or not? Terrifying story of Joseph Stalin's rise to power. Okay, we might actually look at this. at some point. Because those infographics responses, people always seem to like those. Yeah, thanks, Jacob.
This video is sponsored.
Should we watch that now? I want to interact with the chat a little bit more, and then I'll probably watch that. I had some other things to talk about today, but we actually kind of already touched on them. I can go over them quick. Individualism is a hell of a drug. It is. Oh, shoot. There was something from Where Pilgrim I wanted to check out up here. Hello, Where Pilgrim. Hello, Stephen Michael Palazzo. Where is Where Pilgrim's comment? I can't see it. Can't find it. YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels will pick up the slack, I'm certain. Oh, yes, I've been doing more YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels, so just follow us there if you miss our TikToks, honestly. Okay, I seriously can't find it, so I don't know what to do. Oh, well. Sorry, Where Pilgrim. I wanted to answer your question. I love those infographic reacts you do. Okay, good. Does Ohio exist? No, definitely not. Are you on a personal computer right now or a community computer? This computer is owned by the masses, because this computer was bought by the Midwestern Marks PayPal communally, so that we could all get on Twitch and do these streams together and have book club and talk about Lenin's Imperialism. So I consider these means of production, like the microphone I'm using right now and the camera and the stream deck and the computer, to be communally owned. Also, I keep forgetting I have a stream deck and I have all these cool sound effects, and I always forget to use them. Thank you. It goes on forever. Conflating personal property with private property. I'm coming for your toothbrush, Jimmy. Mark said no private property, and that means your Xbox too. All right, let's look at the terrifying story of Joseph Stalin's rise to power.
By World of Warships, a free-to-play naval warfare-themed online game. Download it today using the link in the description. New players will receive 1 million credits. The USS Langley. Joseph Stalin, one of the most feared men of the 20th century, both by his enemies and his own citizens, many of which he in fact considered his enemies, responsible for sequestering off large parts of Europe under the Iron Curtain and for fueling fears of international nuclear war. Just how...
Alright, I'm just gonna restart this for the sake of uploading it on YouTube as one cohesive piece.
Big thanks to Wargaming for sponsoring this video. Joseph Stalin, one of the most feared men of the 20th century, both by his enemies and his own citizens, many of which he in fact considered his enemies, responsible for sequestering off large parts of Europe under the Iron Curtain and for fueling fears of international nuclear war. Just how did this man come to be one of the most notorious figures in history? Born in 1878 as Yosef Vissarionovich Zukashvili, Stalin grew up an only child and son of a poor peasant family. His father was a shoemaker and an alcoholic who vented his frustrations out on his son with regular beatings, and his mother was a laundress, doing laundry for others to earn enough for the family to survive. Contracting smallpox as a child, Stalin would be disfigured for life with...
He was working class. The makings of a dictator, the origins of a dictator. His father was but a shoemaker. He could never run a government like the son of a capitalist, like George Bush, the grandson of a corporate shareholder who helped Adolf Hitler rise to power. Those are the only people who can run governments. I also love how they say Stalin sequestered a huge portion of Europe, as if communism wasn't a specter haunting Europe, and as if there weren't, tons of working class communist uprisings, as if it was just all Stalin, was somehow able to just take over all these countries and rule them with an iron fist. Where Pilgrim, I recall that Warren Buffett chastised critics of his stock buyback activities recently, claiming that either an economic illiterate or a silver-tongued demagogue would say otherwise. I see what he's saying. Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, and that shows the stage of capitalism that we're in, the financial stage of capitalism, where speculation and the manipulation of shares and stocks is the dominant method for becoming rich, or is the dominant way that the ruling class, the financial capitalist class in society, makes their money, rather than getting ahead in commerce, getting ahead by having advancements in production and or transportation or whatever.
His signature facial scars, which only added to his tough exterior demeanor. Surprisingly, Stalin earned a scholarship as a teen to a seminary school in Tbilisi, where he began to study for the priesthood in the Georgian Orthodox Church. However, while in seminary, Stalin began to secretly read German socialist Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Influenced by the social, economic, and political turmoil of 19th century Europe, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the infamous Manifesto in response to the persecution and exploitation of the communists.
Again, I went over this in one of the last bourgeois propaganda ridiculous videos that we watched. Why do they always isolate the manifesto? I mean, I know they do it because it's a good way to take Marx out of context, right? It's a good way to isolate this, 35-page or so party pamphlet for the Communist Party, created by Marx in the 1800s, and say that this is the entire philosophy of Marxism. This is, everything he wrote. And this is everything that he thought was true about the world, when in fact, there's thousands more pages and thousands more pages of intense, in-depth economic analysis, whereas the manifesto basically just summarizes Marxist theory, class struggle and the struggle for socialism, and then encourages the workers to take over the government, like pumps them up. Like I said, it's a party program. But all of these videos, they isolate the manifesto as if it's the core central work of Marxist theory, or as if it's some Bible, something that Marxists hold up dogmatically like a holy book. It just is not accurate. That's not what it is historically. That's not what it is in the context of the broader works of Marxist literature, both by Marx himself and the ones that would come later. It's not a foundational piece of theory. Like I said, it's a party program. It's a workers' pump-up mixtape, and it's a very concise summary of Marxist theory.
Common man by the bourgeoisie, who benefited greatly off the hard labor of the proletariat, whose only real wealth and power was their labor. Marx and Engels called for the proletariat to unify and use their only asset, the labor the bourgeoisie exploited overwhelmingly for their own gain, to barter for more equitable employment terms. A teenage Stalin was immediately hooked on Marx and Engels' words and became interested in the revolutionary movement against the Russian monarchy, which treated citizens as serfs who held few, if any, rights. In 1889, Stalin was expelled from his seminary for missing his exams, but he would go on later to claim that his expulsion was for the discovery of what was deemed Marxist propaganda. Whatever the real reason, Stalin's expulsion set him on a collision course with history. And perhaps if a group of priests had been a bit more tolerant, then history and Russia itself would have been spared untold catastrophes to come. Immediately upon his expulsion, Stalin dove headfirst into political activism, becoming an underground political agitator and
So here's where they individualize it. Earlier they were talking about how Stalin is working class and son of a shoemaker, who was maybe too harsh on him or who abused him physically, and that's what turned him into the leader he was. But childhood trauma definitely does have effects on people. But to act like that's the reasons, Russia turned out the way it did. I mean, Stalin was a very tough leader, right? He was an iron-willed leader who made decisions and stuck with them and followed them through, and did what he thought was right for the construction of socialism. So, his upbringing may have been what crafted his personality and what made him tough, but it's the material conditions, the class conditions in Russia that allowed for the revolution to happen. The development of capitalism that was happening at the time, the dictatorship of the monarchy, the czars, the Russian workers, the Russian troops and soldiers who were constantly being sent to fight and die in these wars for imperialism as capitalism developed into its imperialist stage. This is what allowed Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and whoever else to form this revolutionary movement, lead this revolutionary movement in Russia that overthrew the monarchy and overthrew feudalism. More so than Stalin just being iron-willed. I mean, the material conditions crafted the individuals like Stalin, but it's those material conditions that created the situation, not the individualized personalities of the leaders at the time, which is what Western liberal historians and economists and political analysts always try and do. They always try and individualize history. This great man of history fallacy, as we call it.
Taking part in labor demonstrations and work strikes. At this time, he adopted the name of Kova after a fictional Robin Hood-like Georgian outlaw hero and became a prominent member of the Marxist Social Democratic movement's more militant chapter, the Bolsheviks. At the time, the Bolsheviks were being led by Vladimir Lenin, whom Stalin would immediately idolize for his fiery passion and determination to set Russia's workers free. Stalin eagerly shared in Lenin's dreams of a Russia free of the greed and corruption of capitalism, whose workers shared equitably in the profits of their labor. In order to fund this revolutionary movement, however, Stalin became involved in various criminal enterprises to include bank heists, the proceeds of which all went to fund the Bolshevik Party. In 1906, Stalin married Ekaterina Svanitsa, though tragically she would go on to die a year later, shortly after the birth of Stalin's son Yakov from typhus. Yakov himself would meet a similarly tragic fate, dying during World War II as a prisoner in Germany. In 1912, Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland, appointed Stalin to serve on the first Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, securing Stalin's first true grip on power in what would be the future Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A year later, Stalin was arrested and exiled to Siberia, but in 1917, revolution swept across Russia in what would become known as the Russian Revolution, with Stalin playing a prominent role. A vote of the Bolshevik Central Committee of 10-2 prompted the Bolsheviks to start planning an armed insurrection. After Lenin told committee members that revolution was inevitable, what followed was a struggle that
At least they admit that the Tsarist monarchy and the era of feudalism in Russia was authoritarian or dictatorial, and imprisoned Stalin and exiled Lenin. And they mentioned that the people under this regime had almost no rights, which is what led to the revolution. Some people do apologetics for the Tsar, the monarchy and feudalism when they talk about the Russian Revolution, as if industrializing the country and moving them away from feudalism wasn't a progressive step forward, which is hilarious even for pro-capitalist or bourgeois economists to say, because they should support the move away from feudalism, but whatever.
would see the ruling Tsar and his family ousted from power and then executed, with Lenin leading the way in creating the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, the first self-proclaimed socialist state, seen by Lenin as a tough character who could get things done behind the scenes, or in plain speak, a thug who wasn't afraid to kill political enemies or commit atrocities in the name of the cause. Lenin appointed Stalin to a prominent position during the Red Army's invasion of Georgia, where he got the reputation for being specially brutal against any opposition. Eventually, with the Bolshevik Party's expansion of power, it became necessary to expand the scope for the Central Committee, and at the 11th Congress, the position of Secretariat of the Central Committee was formed, to which Lenin appointed Stalin on the 3rd of April 1922. From then on until his death, Stalin would always be known as
At least they don't try and say that Lenin wanted Trotsky to take over, and then Stalin seized leadership from Trotsky, the rightful leader of the Soviet Union, who would have, made everything work out perfectly and made it so the Soviet Union never collapsed. That's a myth that we hear in the West a lot that I guess didn't make it into this video.
General Secretary, though the position was never intended to be as powerful or dictatorial as Stalin would make it into. Briefly disappointed with his appointment after not being given a heavy ministerial post and seeing the early iteration of the General Secretary as a relatively weak political position, Stalin quit.
That's actually interesting that they say he made it more dictatorial than it was originally supposed to be, because production did become more centralized. It was more decentralized, and there were more markets allowed. It was less top-down. It was less planned. There was less central economic planning. But with the German buildup of their forces, which would later lead to World War II and the invasion of the Soviet Union as Germany tried to take over the world, what we call the rise of fascism, there was a need for the Soviet Union to quickly industrialize and quickly build up their military in order to defend themselves. So the only way that this could be done was with more top-down central economic planning. You couldn't have that much market activity going on or that much decentralization of production, because they needed to focus production on military spending. Otherwise, they were going to be destroyed. And every Western analyst at the time was saying that the Soviet Union would be destroyed, that Germany would capture the Soviet Union, and then it was a matter of what do we do after this. But the Soviet Union losing 20 million or so, probably more, soldiers and citizens in doing so, beat back the German army, took 80% of the casualties in World War II and saved the world from fascism, largely as a result of that central economic planning, which is always conflated with Stalin turning the country into a dictatorship.
Quickly learned how to use the new office to influence and gain advantage over other key persons within the Bolshevik Party. Eventually, Stalin would grow the power of the office, taking it far outside the scope that Lenin or any of the party's members had ever envisioned for it. A few weeks after Stalin's appointment, Lenin suffered a stroke and was forced into semi-retirement. Initially fully supportive of Stalin as general secretary, Lenin's support would eventually wane when he learned of Stalin's brutality against political opponents, abuse of power, and growing internal party struggles. A report from the invasion in Georgia of violent atrocities committed in the
Oh, there we go. There's the Trotskyist myth. Lenin had a stroke, but after he had a stroke and was dealing with serious health issues of the brain, he denounced Stalin for being evil. Yeah, watch our interview with Grover Furr if you want to get more in depth with the false testament from Lenin, or the fabrication of Lenin's accusation against Stalin or claim that Stalin was a dictator.
In the name of the party by supporters of Stalin also soured Lenin's view on this one-time protege. Knowing that his death was imminent, Lenin drafted a political will between December 1922 and January 1923, containing some harsh criticisms of Stalin and fear of the fragmentation of the Bolshevik party. Lenin would go on to die in 1924, throwing the Bolsheviks into disarray and a struggle for power. Stalin, however, took advantage of his position as general secretary to fan the flames of antagonism between political rivals.
Oh my gosh, they're turning him into Rick Moranis from Spaceballs. When he's playing with the dolls, like, oh, what's his name? What's Rick Moranis' character in Spaceballs? Darth Helmet? I don't know. Never mind. Hopefully some people know what I'm talking about.
Took advantage of his position as general secretary to fan the flames of antagonism between political rivals. Stalin had his eye on power the whole time, but his greatest enemy would be Leon Trotsky, a prominent member of the party who was the creator of the Soviet Union's Red Army and was widely considered as intellectually superior to Stalin and a better orator. Stalin, however, would pit the other members of the party against Trotsky, cleverly keeping himself out of Trotsky's direct line of fire and coming off as a mediator. Ultimately, though, the failure of socialist revolutions across Europe led to Stalin's idea of socialism in one country, wherein the Soviet Union should focus on strengthening itself, being preferred over Trotsky's permanent revolution, wherein the revolution should be exported to non-socialist nations because the Soviet Union would never survive alone in a capitalist world. When revolutions across Europe failed and it became
No, please leave me.
Oops, I accidentally started playing the clip from Spaceballs. Stalin believed in exporting revolution. He believed in global revolution. He just believed in, making one country a stronghold of socialism, developing a worker state and socialism in one country, even, if that didn't mean all the surrounding countries also had to be socialist too, in order for that to be done. That could be done in one country. The workers could control the state and the government without, the entire world transitioning to socialism at a similar time. Global revolution, or this is known as Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And a lot of times it makes it seem like Stalin didn't believe in, global revolution, when really the Soviet Union was funding and supporting every revolutionary socialist movement around the world. This is what now sometimes ultras or, sometimes honestly can be rightfully criticized as Soviet social imperialism, I guess. Actually, I don't know how I feel about that. The theory of social imperialism. A lot of times it's just nonsense. But there's a Marxist theory, an idea that the Soviet Union was so involved in funding revolutionary movements around the world that it could have been called imperialism. So it's not that Stalin was against supporting global revolutionary movements, but Trotsky was saying things like the Soviet Union shouldn't go to the aid of France against the Nazis because France is capitalist too. Right, and we should only defend socialist countries, whereas the Stalin would write socialism or Marxism in the national question, and so the Soviet Union would take the position of defending right to national self-determination, right, defending the anti-colonial movements in the global South, defending the sovereignty and the right of the people in any country to choose their own destiny. Believing that eventually the development of production and class struggle will lead to socialism. Now, Venezuela in many ways has kind of embraced Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. There are aspects of it that I do think are useful and correct, but most of them I think are things that Lenin wouldn't reject. That Stalin wouldn't reject. Most of the aspects of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, I think Stalin accepted, because like I said, he was trying to spread global revolution. He just wanted to develop socialism in one country while he did it. And that's where Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution starts to get, like, there's a lot of gray area there too, and you don't know exactly what he's saying. Like, so what is the theory of permanent revolution? If you don't believe in socialism in one country, does that mean the socialist country should start going to war with any capitalist nation who doesn't embrace socialism? Should they, fully embrace like a real form of socialist or communist imperialism where they try and impose it on the rest of the world and, how do you consolidate support from the people to do that? The people in Russia largely went towards socialism and supported the revolution because they were tired of fighting in imperialist wars. They were tired of fighting wars for capitalist expansion. And there was a mutiny in the military, and they sided with the revolutionaries. So, yeah, I don't think constant warfare and socialist imperialism is the way to go. But, not that that's what Trotsky's saying, but sometimes I don't really know what Trotsky's saying when I read The Theory of Permanent Revolution.
Obvious that they would never succeed, Trotsky's fate was sealed, and he was removed from power and eventually expelled from the Communist Party and exiled to Kazakhstan. Having allied with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to oust Trotsky and other rivals, Stalin desired to oust his two former companions, and thus began to court the far-right elements of the Bolshevik Party, eventually ensuring that his former allies would be sent to the Gulag. Stalin then turned on his second set of allies and ousted them as well, leaving Joseph Stalin as the sole autocratic ruler of the entire Soviet Union. Up until this point, Stalin had not yet thought about outright killing his political opponents, but that and a great deal of things would quickly change. With the reins of the Soviet Union firmly in his grasp, Joseph Vissarionovich Yukashvili changed his name to Joseph Stalin, meaning man of steel. Yet Stalin had taken leadership of a troubled nation. Economically and industrially, the Soviet Union lagged behind the rest of European powers, and poor management of crops was leading to a pending famine.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? The Soviet Union industrialized faster than any other country in human history at the time, which would later be surpassed by China, and that's it. It's still the second fastest development of industrialization and increase in living standards that's ever been seen in human history. Right? This is obvious. This is like what Richard Wolff explained to Destiny, the streamer, in that debate about the development of different economies in the 20th century. The Soviet Union was blowing expectations out of the water. Like I said, every Western analyst expected them to get mopped up by the German forces, but they didn't, because the speed at which they were able to industrialize. Illiteracy went from like 17% to 99% in a matter of years as they educated all their people. Electricity and access to power, infrastructure, plumbing, malnutrition was greatly decreased. Poverty was greatly decreased. All these things happened as they industrialized, and they were able to industrialize while under Western sanctions and economic warfare, and without, the help of slavery and this giant cotton market, which fueled industrialization and the rise of capitalism in England and the northern United States. So it was a much more humane and efficient and speedy process of industrialization compared to that which was undergone under capitalism, right? And agriculture, similarly, there's a reason why after the revolution and after the early years of industrialization and collectivization, there aren't any more famines in the Soviet Union, right? There are weather conditions and various factors that lead to famines in the early years of the Soviet Union as they're trying to industrialize agriculture and move towards machine agriculture in this process of collectivization. And, there are people who die in famines, but as with every socialist country, the famines that happen early on in the revolution are the last famines that the country ever experiences, because they do enact machine agriculture. They do produce an incredible amount of infrastructure, an incredible amount of tractors, and other things that allow for the mass production of crops that was never capable, or that the country was never capable of under the feudal economy, under the monarchic, dictatorial feudal system controlled by landlords that they had previously. And maybe that's what they mean by Russia lagging behind in infrastructure. Maybe they're talking about the feudal or semi-feudal system that Russia had, which was far less developed, far less industrialized, far less capitalistic than the system in Europe, in Western Europe at least, in Britain and the United States. But they would quickly industrialize and take over the rest of the world in a way that scared the crap out of the West, and really showed the effectiveness of socialism and socialist planning. And they're talking a whole lot about Trotsky. If you read Trotsky, he says this, right? He says this loud and clear. He says, yes, the Soviet Union has, taught everyone to read. Yes, the Soviet Union has electrified the country. Yes, the Soviet Union has industrialized agriculture so we can feed everyone. Yes, the Soviet Union produces far more tractors and agricultural infrastructure than the capitalist world. but Stalin's a dictator and the political system is messed up, and here's what I want to change. Right? But they only take the parts of Trotsky that they like, that feed this imperialist mainstream bourgeois narrative.
1927 had produced only 70% of the grain that 1926 had yielded. The signs were clear. Radical change was needed, and needed immediately. Unfortunately for the citizens of the Soviet Union, that change would come in the wrong form. Blaming the kulaks, affluent peasants, and the netmen, small business owners, for the poor economic state of affairs, Stalin traveled to Novosibirsk and claimed that the kulaks...
I love how they blame Stalin by saying that he just hoarded all the grain. He just took a giant spoon and ate all the grain, when there were literally wealthy, affluent farmers, right? The highest class of peasants who owned, huge swaths of land, the kulaks, who a lot of the lower class peasants worked under, who were literally hoarding the grain, right? Who were literally trying to prevent their land from being taken by hoarding the product that they were in control of because of their ownership of the means of production. And it caused people to die. It exacerbated the famine caused by weather conditions and other factors, and the state and Stalin had to intervene, right, to try and get people fed, to try and end this famine, to try and stop the hoarding of grain. But then they just invert it, right? They project whatever the capitalists were doing onto the socialists and claim it was the socialists' fault. It wasn't the kulaks, the wealthy farmers who controlled the means of production that create grain, hoarding the grain, even though that makes perfect sense that they would do that. It was Stalin doing it just because he's so evil and he just hates the people of Ukraine so much. And he wants people to starve under this economic system. Like, if he supports socialism, why would he want to purposefully starve millions of people? That makes socialism look terrible. But he just did it because he was so evil and he was so bitter towards the people of Ukraine. Just like Putin. Putin is probably Stalin's grandson.
Kulaks were hoarding grain for themselves and ordered the kulaks be arrested and their grain confiscated, which Stalin promptly brought back with him to Moscow. Having tested the limits of his power and finding no significant blowback to his cruel actions, Stalin immediately ordered the creation of grain procurement squads across much of the...
The kulaks were hoarding grain, and Stalin said, "You think you can hoard grain? Watch this." And he arrested them all, pulling out his giant ice cream scooper and eating all their grain in front of them. There was then a famine because Stalin ate enough grain to feed 3 million people.
growing regions of Soviet Union, and violence immediately broke out between these government thieves and the peasants defending their rightfully grown and earned grain. Some of the Central Committee members were horrified at these measures, but in January 1930, the Politburo approved the liquidation of the entire kulak class. Accused kulaks were rounded up and exiled or thrown into gulags, with many dying on their way to the prison camps. At about that same time, Stalin initiated the policy of mass collectivization of agriculture, which set up collective farms made up of formerly privately owned property. Peasants reluctantly joined these collective farms for fear of suffering the same fate as the kulaks, due to the resentment at the loss of their...
I love how, you know, the bourgeois ideologues, the capitalist ideologues, like Stalin was evil, right? He was taking these people, these capitalists who were hoarding grain and starving people, creating famines on purpose to try and hoard wealth and accumulate more wealth. And he was arresting them and he was stopping them from doing that. How evil of him. Like, you can see they're terrified of any kind of authority being used to put power and to put economic power and control the means of production in the hands of the working class and take it out of the hands of the ruling capitalist class, even if that ruling capitalist class is starving people and acting as authoritarian as they possibly could. Like today, you know, who are the kulaks? We don't have wealthy peasants. Agriculture is largely controlled by shareholders like Bill Gates. Like I said, finance capitalists, speculation, people who specialize in speculation and manipulating stocks. And Bill Gates uses his charities and his NGOs that he donates to get tax write-offs to control agriculture in places like Africa. And I wrote an article about that recently, actually, which you can check out at midwesternmarks.com. Called Bill Gates' Failed Effort to Feed Africa. Was he even trying to help in the first place? Spoiler alert, he was not even trying to help in the first place. He was trying to control African agriculture and keep wages and production costs as low as possible and he ended up poisoning their soil using fertilizer, Western fertilizer that wasn't meant for the African soil, and also turning their soil monocropic, as imperialist agriculture often does. And Africa had a summit, a bunch of African agricultural experts had a summit to say, hey, Bill Gates, you poisoned our soil. None of your promises have come true. And this so-called green revolution, this green agricultural revolution that Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched in Africa has been a failure. It's been a method to poison the soil, sell a bunch of Western fertilizer from Western fertilizer companies, which, guess what, Bill Gates owns large majority shares in, and control the agriculture in Africa to make more money from that product as well. So really, this charity has been a scam. And if the workers were to come to power, if a socialist government were to come to power, of course, we should use the government to stop this. We should use the government to seize Bill Gates's assets and investigate what he's doing. But that is what the bourgeois ideologues would decry as authoritarian. You're acting as a dictator because using the authority in the interests of the working masses is what the capitalist ruling class bourgeois ideologues call authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And that's what Stalin did with the kulaks.
Privately owned land and low morale. Productivity plummeted and famines broke out. Large armed upswings arose throughout the Soviet Union, which were brutally put down by the Red Army, which killed almost as many of its own citizens as the Nazis would a decade later. Opposition to Stalin and his brutal policies arose from within.
Both sides. Communism and fascism are the same, even though the liberals collaborated with the fascists and corporations collaborated with the fascists, and the communists are the ones who beat them.
In the Politburo, but these opponents were in the minority and quickly removed from power. Stalin claimed to be building the communist utopia he dreamed of as a youth, replacing exploitative capitalist practices with equality and granting workers a fair share of the prosperity they generate.
All right, folks, I got to be done with this. I can't do it anymore. They said communism is when you build a utopia, and Stalin thought he was building a utopia. And you know my rule. My rule is if they call socialism or Marxism utopian, I jump out my window. Just kidding, but I can't do it anymore. Engels wrote a whole pamphlet for you guys called Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. He wrote a whole pamphlet just criticizing the utopians and talking about how utopian socialism is not the way. How we need scientific socialism. We must build socialism slowly, constructed out of capitalism. And the birthmarks of the old mode of production always make themselves felt and can be seen in the new mode of production. So therefore, we need to take this system of capitalism and build socialism out of it, transform socialism out of it, sublate capitalism, turn it into socialism slowly but surely. Not just create this utopian society overnight. And in fact, there never is going to be a utopian society. There's no such thing. There will always be contradictions, and humans will always be mortal, right? And there will always be things that make us sad. But we can control production. We can have democracy in production, just like liberalism claims to have democracy in the political system. And we can make society and life better. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say Bill Gates responded to the summit in Africa criticizing his agricultural policies by saying, yes, the Green Revolution has failed. I acknowledge that it's been a complete failure and has reached none of its goals. And the answer to this is to sell more fertilizer. And then he invested millions more dollars in continuing the Green Revolution, but changed its name, changed what it was called. So doing the exact same thing, even after there was a summit in Africa requesting that he didn't. And one of the most interesting parts about that article, which I hope I sent to you all, I did, yes. One of the most interesting parts about that article is after the summit, which was not covered anywhere in Western media other than like a short article in the Seattle Times, like this local newspaper in Seattle who covered this summit of African agricultural experts who called for an end to Bill Gates's charity scam. which is actually a way to exploit Africa that's led to the poisoning of their soil by Western fertilizer. The only article that was published by it was an article that actually didn't even mention it, didn't even mention the summit, other than the Seattle Times article I mentioned. There was an article published a few days later by, who was it? A few days after the summit. Hold on, let me go to my sources. I don't know where's. Oh yeah, it was the New York Times. Okay, so there was this article in the Seattle Times covering the summit in Africa. Other than that, it really wasn't covered anywhere in Western media. And then a few days after the summit, there was this piece from the New York Times, which didn't even mention it, right? Didn't even mention that there was a summit in Africa criticizing Bill Gates and the Green Revolution. But Bill Gates acknowledged a lot of the criticisms that were made in that summit, right? So it's clear that he knew the summit happened. He knew that agricultural experts in Africa came together to criticize, what his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was doing and how it was just manipulating things for the benefit of companies that Bill Gates owned shares in and for his own profit. But it doesn't mention that the summit actually happened. So he says, yes, I know the Green Revolution failed to meet all its goals. I know that we're in a worse place than I expected. I know that, the fertilizer has damaged the African soil. But we actually need to invest more money and sell them more fertilizer. This was his takeaway. So they take the summit criticizing him, completely ignore it, other than, brushing aside some of the criticisms that were made, and then come away with the opposite conclusion. Right? Oh, you don't want us to sell you any more fertilizer and manipulate agricultural markets using philanthropy? Well, we're going to do that way more. And we're going to follow up this article with a multi-million-dollar investment in expanding Bill Gates' control of African agriculture. So, yeah, I recommend you read this article. When I take the time to sit down and write an article and systematize my arguments like this, it's either something that I've written for class, something that I've written for my graduate program that I think is really interesting and that I can pretty easily turn into a Midwestern Marx article, or it's something I really care about and that I think is absolutely insane and crazy and that people need to know about and that I want to be able to cite whenever I can or whenever I need to. And this is one of those instances. So yeah, this article blew up a bit on TikTok, and there were some tweets tweeting out videos of me talking about this article that blew up on Twitter. So some people liked it, but cauliflower ears, yep, cauliflower, sweet and sour, VeggieTales. Oh yeah, one more thing. In reference to the clip of Stalin playing with dolls in the last video.
So, Princess Vespa, at last I have you in my clutches to have my way with you the way I want to.
No, please leave me alone.
No, you are mine.
Not so fast, Helmet.
Lone Star.
Yes, it's me. I'm here to save my girlfriend. Hi, honey.
Now you are going to die.
Oh! Hey, what'd you do to my friend?
The same thing I'm going to do to you, big boy. Oh, and you too.
Oh!
Now, Princess Vespa, at last we are alone.
No, I hate you, leave me alone. Yet, I find you strangely attractive.
Of course you do. Jewish princesses are often attracted to money and power, and I have both, and you know it.
Oh, leave me alone.
No, kiss me.
No, yes, no, yes, no, yes. Oh, your helmet is so big.
Lord Helmet, what? You need it on the bridge, sir.
Knock on my door, knock next time.
Yes, sir. Did you see anything?
No, sir. I didn't see you playing with your dolls again.
Good.
Yeah, and that movie and that scene was actually based on George Bush, at a time that they saw him playing with, his dolls, trying to invade Iraq and Iran. So it wasn't even based on Stalin. But if I had more energy right now, if I didn't do homework for 8 hours today, I would do an impression of George Bush playing with dolls. But I can't do it right now. Fool me one time, can't get fooled again. Rick Moranis quit acting at the peak of his career to be a good father for his kids. That's pretty honorable and pretty impressive, but then like he shrunk his kids down to the size of like a pea, right? And they almost got eaten by bugs in the front yard. In Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So, really, is it that honorable that he quit acting to be a good father when he literally shrunk his kids and they almost got eaten by a praying mantis? Just kidding. I'm a big Rick Moranis fan. In his defense, he told his wife he did that. True. He said, honey, I shrunk the kids. I apologize. Did everyone see there's another infrastructure blowout in Cali? There's thousands of people without power after a bunch of cold and snow and rain and ice. So another day, another infrastructure failure. And what's interesting, I think, about this one is the last infrastructure failure that was huge national news was the one in Houston, Texas. And this pretty much got blamed on GOP politicians, Republican politicians, and Democrats attacked them rightfully because Texas is a GOP state, and deregulation and refusal to fund infrastructure and anything that actually helps working people largely led to the power grid failure that crushed people in Houston, Texas. But now we have California, California, this hyper liberal state, which a lot of confused conservatives call communist and claim is a communist state, where we also have the infrastructure being crushed by weather conditions, leaving thousands of people without power. So, I just want to make that point because it's not a Republican or a Democrat thing, right? These infrastructure failures are part of a chapter that we're going to get to soon in our reading guide for Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and which you can actually see on our previous reading guide of Lenin's Imperialism, which is finished on our YouTube channel, called The Decay of Imperialism, where the imperialist countries become financial oligarchies dominated by bankers and shareholders, and their manufacturing bases and their bases of production start to be outsourced and destroyed and essentially decay. And that's what we're seeing right now with U.S. infrastructure. We're sending all of our surplus to Ukraine in the forms of weapons, or in the form of weapons, in order to wage this proxy war against Russia, in order to further this imperialist project that benefits the U.S. ruling class, while neglecting anything that would benefit the working class. Right? All our tax dollars can go to, according to the politicians in charge, are corporate bailouts, the bailouts of big banks, or war, imperialist projects abroad. So, of course, if you're investing the surplus of your country's labor in that nonsense, the important things like infrastructure are going to fall apart at home. And that's what Lenin calls the decay of imperialism. And that's what we're seeing now in Democrat and Republican states, and communist states like California. So in Cali, there were 85,000 households and businesses that were out without power in the Los Angeles area alone. There was flooding that blocked the largest interstate in the area, as well as a lot of important roads. And there are more infrastructure impacts that are expected as cold and snow increase in the near future. So the way to combat this is central economic planning, right? That is the way to resist this, not only to focus labor and focus the country's surplus in terms of resources and labor on developing infrastructure, which would also allow us to transition off of fossil fuels and create tons and tons, thousands, if not, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new jobs, that we would be able to create hundreds and thousands of new jobs working on that infrastructure. But that if we did it by through, sorry, I'm really stuttering there. If we did it through central economic planning, rather than allowing the capitalist ruling class to produce based on whatever's profitable for them in the market, we could build infrastructure that's resistant to snow. And I was talking to my buddy who's an engineer, and he works with the company that manages a lot of the water infrastructure here in the town that I live in. And he's talking about how there are still, underground centrifuges or pipes that transport water that are made out of wood, right? And they're from the early 1900s, the early 20th century, and they haven't been replaced because the resources aren't there to replace them. And, no company wants to spend the money to update the infrastructure, right? If the infrastructure still brings water to the surface and people are reliant on water, why update that infrastructure if it's going to cost money and cut into corporate profits, cut into corporate dividends? So our infrastructure decays because these corporations are more focused on profits than investing in, really maintaining that infrastructure and improving it in a way that improves quality of water and other things like that for the masses. And instead, they cut production costs as low as they can and push corporate dividends as high as they can. And like I said, my buddy is a pretty successful engineer who works directly with the water infrastructure in town. And he's always talking about this. He talked to me about this for hours this weekend. We got to go on a long car ride together. And he discussed how old and outdated the infrastructure is, and how inefficiently engineering resources and economic planning is done. And if we had central economic planning, we could really invest in rebuilding this infrastructure, rebuilding it in a way that's sustainable with the environment, and rebuild it in a way that's resistant to changing weather conditions and worsening weather conditions, as well as bringing back a bunch of jobs, like I said, and spending less of our nation's surplus on imperialist projects abroad. But this is only going to happen, if the working class seizes the government in an effort to seize the means of production, right? The source of economic power in society, the tools, the factories, the buildings that workers' labor is combined with in order to create products and in order to create wealth and in order to create the surplus of society, right? If workers control their labor, but the capitalists control the means of production, we'll be forced to sell our labor to capitalists in order to survive because they own the tools that create the means of subsistence, the products we need to continue living, food, water, and the other things like this. But if those who labor control the means of production that's combined with their labor in order to create the things we need to survive, then we can control those tools, we can control that infrastructure, we can plan the economy in a way that's beneficial to all of us, that builds up our real economy, right? That moves away from this dependence on fossil fuels and things that are destroying the environment and slowly killing us and polluting our society, I guess, polluting civilization, polluting nature, for lack of a better word. So the nation's surplus, right? When I say the U.S. is investing our nation's surplus in proxy wars abroad, I mean the value that is created by human labor being combined with nature beyond what human society needs to survive, beyond what it needs to reproduce itself, right? So beyond whatever level of means of subsistence, whatever commodities need to be produced for humans to continue living somewhat normally under somewhat consistent standards of living. So things like shelter, Things like water, like I said earlier, transported by infrastructure and pipes under the ground, which are decaying and are highly outdated. There are also still lead pipes, my friend was telling me, my engineering buddy, which is crazy, especially in inner city areas. Like Chicago, I believe, was one of the places he was saying. But either way, the surplus is the value that's created beyond what's needed to survive. So this can come in the form of goods that are hoarded, right? Surplus of goods that are stored in warehouses controlled by factories or hoarded by capitalists, or that just sit around or whatever. Or it can come in the form of profit, right? Capitalists sell their products and reinvest the money in production, continuing normal production, continuing to buy the normal amount of labor and tools needed to continue their normal operations, and also in expanding production and expanding markets, which is another utilization of the surplus that's created, the value above what's needed to reproduce their normal operations. But then a lot of it's also handed out to the capitalists and handed out to shareholders in dividends, right? Or stock buybacks. And profit is a form of the nation's surplus. So instead of investing that profit in healthcare or social programs or infrastructure or a jobs guarantee or anything that would benefit the workers, it's hoarded by capitalists in bank accounts or used by capitalists to consume absurd amounts of commodities, or used by capitalists to reinvest in production, or used by capitalists to lobby the government so they can control the government and use it as a dictatorship of capital, control it and use it to facilitate their own accumulation and suppress the working masses, which they also do by funding imperialist projects, like we said. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the U.S. proxy war and the coup effort in Ukraine since 2014, and even before then, right? All of that is the nation's surplus. All of that is money above the what we need to reproduce the current level of means of subsistence. And instead of being reinvested in protecting our infrastructure, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure that is not resistant to harsh weather conditions, which are increasing because our infrastructure and our economy is entirely based on fossil fuels, instead of investing in doing something about that, or investing in bringing people out of poverty and bettering people's lives and paying people higher wages, we invest in imperialist proxy wars abroad. We invest in hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine, which is why Biden going to Kiev, Ukraine, after the recent train derailment in Ohio, which leaked a bunch of dangerous chemicals, which caused a bunch of people to drink contaminated water and get sick, is so symbolic, right? Why it matters and why people are so angry about it. It shows the link between imperialism, the use of the country's surplus on expanding markets abroad and controlling foreign markets and labor forces and resources, to decay domestically, right? What Lenin calls the decay of imperialism. The infrastructure is falling apart at home. There's more and more train derailments and accidents, and the working conditions for rail workers is worse and worse. And they've been telling us about this for years. Yet instead of investing in rebuilding rail, right, instead of investing in a jobs guarantee that gives people a lot of good paying jobs with healthcare and other benefits working on the railroad to rebuild this important infrastructure, we're sending all of our money, all of our surplus towards weapons in Ukraine and allowing the infrastructure at home to fall apart, right, to the point where you have train derailments that are poisoning a bunch of people. Our infrastructure is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It's pouring chemicals into the waterway rather than cleaning and filtering the water and allowing people to get it cleanly and safely and efficiently. So this is the decay of imperialism, and the recent, national news story about East Palestine, Ohio, and Biden's trip to Ukraine is a perfect example of that decay and a perfect example of the state of global capitalism and American capitalism right now. So yeah, the surplus that we were talking about, the value that's produced by human labor, beyond what's needed to produce the regular means of subsistence, what everyone needs to survive normally, is what we call surplus value, right? And capitalist production, this is one of the main discoveries in Marx's Capital Volume 1, is that capitalist production and his theories of surplus value, capitalist production, for the third time, is the production of surplus value, right? So that is the goal. When capitalists organize production, when they administrate labor, when they decide to invest capital in various areas and try and control certain markets, they're not aiming to produce the highest quality products, right? They're not aiming to produce commodities for their use value, what they'll provide to certain populations, how well they'll take care of society. They're administrating production and investing in production to produce surplus value, to produce profit, even in areas like healthcare, right? Where the main goal of the whole industry and organizations involved in healthcare should be treating people's illness, making people healthy. Instead, our healthcare system has become inverted, and it just focuses on exploiting people, selling people commodities as highly priced as possible in order to make as much money as possible. So this is because of the basic contradiction within capitalism, within the capitalist commodity, between exchange value and use value. Capitalists want exchange value. They want money, which, every commodity has a money value attached to it, and it can be sold in the market and transformed into money, more than they want to produce use values, more than they want to produce things that are useful. You have to produce something useful in order to sell it in the market, right? In order to hold it over people's heads and force them to spend a bunch of money on it if they want it. This isn't the use value. It's just an inconvenience for the capitalists that they have to produce things that are useful. Otherwise, nobody will buy it. Which goes along pretty well with Lenin's Imperialism reading guide that we've been doing. Applause for that lecture. Someone once asked Marx, Engels, and Lenin, would you rather have a wife or a mistress? And Engels, who was a little bit more of a partier than Marx, said, I would rather have a mistress. That would be more fun. That's what I would rather do. I like to party and be a little crazy. And then Marx, who was a devoted family man, said, I would rather have a wife. A wife offers support, offers stability in life. The family unit is the economic cell of capitalist society. It offers us support and community within this isolated, fragmented system of capitalism. I would rather have a wife. And Lenin says, I would have both. I would have a wife and a mistress. So my wife could hang out with my mistress, and my mistress hang out with my wife, while I find a solitary place to read, and study the works of Marx. That was a good one, Vlad. I'm getting the chance to use all my sound effects today. Can y'all hear my sound effects? I hope you can. Otherwise, that whole segment I just did is kind of stupid. Not the whole segment, but just the stupid jokes I just told. All right. Sick. Thanks. Have a good rest of your day, Eddie. You too, Nathan. Thanks for stopping by. This will be available on the channel later, if not immediately after the stream ends. Absolutely. If you go to... So I know some people want to rewatch the stream right after it ends because they missed it, or they missed part of it, or had to go to bed or whatever. So you can rewatch the entire stream either on our Twitch account, where it's saved as a VOD, is the name of it on Twitch. So this is just some technical stuff. Name of it on Twitch. Oh man, we're having streamception right now. That's not good. So you go here to Midwestern Marks, I believe, and then videos or VODs, or it'll be on home. And then you can also do this on YouTube. You just go to live. You have to go to the live section. You can see it's already here. These are all of our full live streams, which I need to remember to make thumbnails for next time, or every time. But we also edit the videos, the live streams into clips, into highlights, and upload them here. So eventually you'll be able to see these different segments in the video section. But if you want to see them immediately, they'll be in the live section. YouTube.com/MidwesternMarks, as I'm sure you all know because you're here, or you're on Twitch.com/MidwesternMarks, Twitch.tv, sorry. And yeah. That's that. Real theory hours. That's facts. The people who come to the Midwestern Marks streams, especially the late night streams, are the people who are here for the in-depth theory. Y'all are here to hear about Marx and Lenin and the absolute most complicated things that they wrote. Just kidding. But the most important things that they wrote. Because you can't get that theoretical analysis anywhere else, except for twitch.tv and youtube.com/MidwesternMarks. See, that's why I hate advertising or marketing myself or our streams. It just sounds egotistical to me. But whatever. Can I do an ad on Twitch? Oops, I think I just did an advertisement on Twitch, and I didn't even mean to do that. I was trying to click on a link. Rest in peace to headphone users there. Drake and Josh meme, someone said.
Come on, Josh. It's got to be around here somewhere.
I can't believe you convinced me to come all the way with you to Russia because the mail sent your concert tickets to the wrong place.
Eric Clapton tickets, Josh. The holy grail of all Erics. Come on, help me look around. He said he left it in here somewhere.
All right, just hurry up. What is this place anyway? Some kind of power plant?
Yeah, it's a nuclear reactor or something.
What?
What?
What did you say?
That it's a reactor or something?
No, I got that part. I was referring to when you said it was nuclear.
Relax. Nothing's gonna happen. We'll be in and out. Dang, it's dark in here. I think this might be the lights. There we go.
What did you do?
I don't know. I just pulled down this lever and...
You go to nuclear reactor pulling levers? You are not the certified pulling levers.
You, dude. What's gonna happen just because I pulled one lever?
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
That's funny that they got the actual laugh track from Drake and Josh. I can recognize it. Not as cool as my laugh track, but that's kind of funny. Their Drake and Josh impressions weren't that good. The writing was good, like that one joke. What did he say? Like, he's the most important of all the Erics. Like, that's definitely something that's definitely a joke that would be written in a Drake and Josh episode that would get a laugh track. But their impressions weren't that great. Either way, that was funny. I'm reading the Gundrissa right now. Are you? That's awesome. I started reading the Gundrissa, but it just got me inspired to read volume 2 again. So now I picked up volume 2 and I'm almost done. I'm well over halfway, probably like 3/4 of the way or even more through volume 2. And then I'll go back to the Gundrissa. But for those who don't know, volume 1 is where Marx talks about capitalist production. Volume 2 is where he talks about the circulation of the products that are produced in production and the value created in production. Volume 3 is where he talks about the combination of production and circulation. And he wanted to write many more volumes about crises and other things, but there's also the theories of surplus value, which can be considered volume 4, basically. And then there's the Gundrissa, which is, you can see that's where I'm at. And I read the introduction by Martin Nicolaus, which is really, really good. But this is where Marx is deciding how he wants to write Capital, how he wants to map out his argument and his analysis of the capitalist system. So here you see him planning to write this volume 1 about production, volume 2 about circulation, volume 3 about the connection between the two, and working through different questions that he has, different problems, different analyses that need to be made of the capitalist system. So that's the Grundrisse. It's almost like the preface to Capital, or the introduction. It's like watching The Hobbit before you watch The Lord of the Rings. It really is The Hobbit before you read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Here's where I'm at in volume 2. Oh yeah, I'm like almost getting to like 4/5 of the way done. That's how much I have left. This is how much I'm through. It does start to get a little dry, I'm not gonna lie, when he's talking about the circulation of capital and the different kinds of capital and how they circulate, and the difference between fluid capital and fixed capital, and the reason why all capital is circulating capital. But also in healthcare administration, which is my graduate program, I have to study healthcare economics, which, is based on neoclassical bourgeois capitalist economics. So this helps me understand that, and helps me analyze the capitalist healthcare system that I'm learning about, and how it works. And then I'm also studying accounting, and managerial financial accounting in healthcare, related to healthcare. And capital in many ways is a work of accounting. It's how do we measure value? And when Marx is asking these questions about value and how value is produced and circulated, he's going through these thick accounting notebooks from various capitalist firms at the time, right, to see how they measure the value that they produce, how they measure the value that they circulate, how they, take the money that they create and reinvest it in production, to reproduce what they need to continue normal operations and then expand production, and how they measure value in general. And he uses the capitalist bases for measuring value to make his analysis of capitalism and make his analysis of value production, which would be necessary for any kind of socialist accounting in the future, and was necessary for the Soviet Union in their economic planning models in China. Capital, especially volumes 2 and 3, were super important for that. And these reproduction schemas that Marx creates that are so complicated, that melted my brain when I read them. But yeah, so I can relate Capital 2 and 3 to healthcare administration, because healthcare administration is nothing but the management of labor and resources in order to make profit. Which is why I'm not actually going to go into the healthcare administration field, because I know I would end up exploiting people and becoming an opportunist. I started going to the People's Forum recently. Oh, very cool. I like People's Forum. I know they've been accused of getting some weird funding sources, but they're largely good. People accuse them of being liberals, but I think it's just because, they're an academic organization. They give platforms to academics, including academics like Vijay Prashad, who defends the Soviet Union and stuff like that, and defends China and existing socialism. So it's not like, they're just doing these liberal book forums all the time, or hyper liberal or imperialist book forums all the time. But they're a Western academic institution, and most of the Western academics in the West have liberal tendencies, right? Even the ones who consider themselves Marxists. And you can criticize this, and the People's Forum would be a good place to criticize these things and bring them up, as Vijay Prashad does to David Harvey when they do something together at the People's Forum. But it's not, the People's Forum themselves, who are liberal. They just give platforms to different academics. And like I said, there's a lot of liberalism that even influences the Marxist academics here in the Western world, Western Europe and the US, But, I think it's better to go to these open discussions, go to these forums and raise these issues. I think this was at the People's Forum when Vijay did this. Let me see here. Search. Maybe it wasn't the People's Forum. But either way, very similar thing. Or maybe it is the People's Forum.
I mean, David.
Did I say People's Forum?
Landlord's book
I don't know, I can't tell. But either way, VJ had a critique of his friend David Harvey and some of these Marxists who reject China, reject China's poverty alleviation efforts, and reject everything that they've done in order to construct socialism. He calls them out. He criticizes them. He says, I agree with a lot of what you guys say, but you don't get it. You live on the other side of imperialism, right? China has raised more people out of poverty than India has living in extreme poverty today, right? So as someone who's from India, you think we don't wish that our country moved towards socialism. You don't think it would have been better for India to move towards socialism and abolish relative poverty the way China has? You think it's better for India to live with all these people in extreme poverty, or that capitalism in India is just the exact same thing as socialism in China, despite the millions of people who have had their standard of living vastly increase and who have been freed from starvation and economic hardship and debilitation. And of course, this is a move towards socialism. It's a move away from capitalism and towards socialism. And, it's hard for Americans who have always lived in the industrialized world to see this. But in the East, where you have India in a state of extreme poverty, where there's, huge sentiment among the workers to move towards a socialist or more China-esque system, it's more apparent that China is socialist and that they have actually achieved a lot, and that existing socialism has achieved a lot. And because they're more able to look at what China had before, right? Like Michael Parenti says, you always have to look at what a country had before the revolution when you're analyzing existing socialism. You can't just look at Cuba in 1961 and be like, well, they don't have as much wealth as the US, 2 years after the revolution. Well, of course they don't have that much wealth. The US has been stealing their wealth for hundreds of years or 100 years. They need to build up their infrastructure using economic planning because they now have control of their economy, which they're going to have to do in the face of horrible economic sanctions and, every attempt from the U.S. to prevent their economy from developing. But still, these countries like China, Cuba, Soviet Union, DPRK abolished illiteracy in a matter of years, industrialized their country, brought electric power and the heating of homes to everybody in their country. And these are countries that were semi-feudal dictatorships beforehand, right? Cuba was a plantation economy that basically had slavery dominated by a U.S. puppet gangster dictator. And Havana, Cuba was filled with brothels and casinos and was basically a more degenerate version of Las Vegas. And after the revolution, that's actually why Las Vegas became a thing. Because the capitalists needed a place to go gamble and use prostitutes and be degenerates. After the revolution, kicked that out of Havana. Then they taught everybody to read, ended plantation labor, did all these great things. So if you look at, and brought everybody healthcare. So if you look at what they had before the revolution versus after, it's not even close. China, the same thing. In 70 years, they've gone from a place with no industrialized agriculture, right? A largely feudal country based off of peasants who were controlled by landlords who would torture and kill them if they didn't produce enough, to a country that's literally abolished relative poverty, to a country that's making advancements in technology, making advancements in computer science, making advancements in physics and other realms of science, a country where there are trains connecting every major city, a country where they're moving away from fossil fuels and towards sustainability, a country where their army, their military, instead of invading other countries, instead of setting up 1,000 military bases all around the world like the US, they've planted a forest the size of Ireland. That's what the People's Liberation Army has been doing in China for a while. to combat deforestation, and maintain what Marx calls the free gifts of nature, the value that's created by nature and made available to humans if it's combined with labor, if humans use their labor and human activity to interact with nature and produce things like lumber and timber. But you need to, especially now that human production has reached the level it has, we see like the Amazon being cut down, and deforestation really becoming a thing, which has environmental effects as well as economic effects on production. So China is reinvesting or investing labor in maintaining the free gifts of nature. This is the power of central economic planning, right? This is the power of using central planning to control your economy instead of acting like the markets are sovereign and acting like human societies need to bow down to the market and let it control every aspect of our lives and every aspect of society. And what's so interesting is, there's still Americans and still Westerners who will just deny anything good about China and, deny China's poverty alleviation efforts. They didn't really abolish poverty. It was relative poverty, right? When relative poverty was the metric designed by the World Bank, right? A Western arm of finance capital, one of the most central pillars or central forms of finance capital's power, or central arms or bodies or institutions of finance capital's power in the world, right? Of Western imperialist finance capital's power. That's the World Bank, and they're the ones who invented this metric for poverty. And that's the metric by which China alleviated poverty. And people will still be like, nope, not real poverty. Like, even by the standards of the West and the Western finance capitalists and the imperialists, they have abolished poverty, right? And then bourgeois institutions like the UN, an institution which has largely been crafted and controlled by the US and Western finance capital since its inception, only not doing so because of certain good or well-meaning individuals working within the organization, especially like investigators and human rights reporters who work within the UN, who have oftentimes been silenced or attacked by higher-ups for exposing the truth, and because of China and formerly the Soviet Union and now Russia's place in the UN Security Council. But other than that, it's largely a bourgeois institution that largely aligns itself with Western finance capital, and is controlled and administrated mostly by Western finance capital. Even they have applauded China's poverty alleviation efforts and tried to study them, right? Looked into them pretty deeply because they want to ask, how can we replicate this? How can we replicate this country that abolished relative poverty when in the US, the richest country in the world, poverty is increasing every year? Right? We can't even figure this out in the wealthiest, most industrialized country in the world, where the economy seems to be decaying, like we said, with the decay of imperialism. But in China, this place where 70 years ago they had a backwards feudal peasant-based economy, they've abolished poverty. How do we study this? What do we do about this? What do we do to replicate this? So it's just crazy that people still deny, the effectiveness or the achievement of China's poverty alleviation efforts, and even extending that to the Belt and Road Initiative. Like, everyone thinks China's not everyone, but a lot of Westerners think China is doing imperialism. I even heard who's that guy on the Jimmy Dore show, the funny comedian who does the show with him, Kurt Metzger. I even heard him talking about Chinese debt trapping and stuff the other day, and I know that's just because him and Jimmy are comedians, right? And they're not scholars or political analysts, but they're usually, right on these issues. They usually take the right position. So it says something that even they have been tricked into thinking that China's Belt and Road Initiative is not another effort to alleviate poverty and build up the productive forces of various countries, but it's an effort to control them and debt trap them the same way the US and the IMF and the World Bank have done for the last 100 years or so. when in fact China is trying to counter the economic warfare efforts of Western finance capital and build up the industry in these countries so they can replicate China's poverty alleviation or something similar. And I was gonna show something else, but I can't remember what it was in relation to that. But oh yeah, so Vijay Prashad, since we're talking about this, I don't even know what got me on this rant. I think I was talking about the People's Forum. But like obviously the UN has studied China's poverty alleviation efforts a little bit, which is just interesting because they're a bourgeois institution that acknowledges the success of socialist China. But if you want a much more in-depth, a much more Marxist, and a much more accurate or detailed report on poverty alleviation in China, the eradication of extreme poverty, check out this piece from the Tricontinental Institute. I think this is a must-read. This is one of my favorite reports that Vijay has ever put out, Vijay Prashad, and he's one of my favorite academics in existence, especially in modern day. Because this is just so useful. It's so valuable right now. Like I said, the UN is studying China's poverty alleviation to try and replicate it. So Marxists should be too. And the fact that there are Marxists out here saying that China's not real socialism, that their poverty alleviation efforts and that their Belt and Road Initiative are stupid and there's nothing to learn from them, and they're just capitalism is ridiculous. Right? Why, as a socialist, would we look at a socialist country eradicating poverty and be like, nope, capitalism did that? Like, what are you doing? So read this report, please, if you're one of the people who thinks China's capitalist or that they haven't accomplished anything for workers. It goes really in depth about how they've done this. The targeted poverty alleviation, by example, is really interesting. It talks about how there are both centralized and decentralized forms of economic planning. And forms of economic control and distribution of important economic information. So you have like these party cadres related to the Communist Party of China, which is separate from the government, but has 100 million members making it up, dedicated members who work diligently for the party for the construction of socialism and communism, who are in control of specific areas, in control of specific geographical areas or localities, or different towns or whatever. And therefore, they're in charge of different populations. So you have these central economic plans, and central goals that are created by the party and created democratically by the people. But then you have these decentralized party cadres who are in charge of every locality, who make sure that the central economic principles and central economic plans are being enforced, and make sure that the people's needs are being met, make sure that the people have food, water, shelter. And then in the modern era, it's transitioned to making sure people have things like Wi-Fi, right? Making sure people can heat their homes and have electricity, and things that you need in the modern world. So it's just really, really interesting to study, and really, really interesting to get, into the nitty gritty of this. I know it's like in-depth economic analysis, which doesn't sound like the most interesting or fun thing to study, but it really is, because, we're lied to so much about China's poverty alleviation efforts and how amazing they really are, and how incredible they've really been. And we're lied to about, the power of economic planning. We're lied to about the infallibility of the market all the time. And this just exposes it all by analyzing reality, simply analyzing, the material developments in China's economy over the last 70 years. So it's really exciting to read. It's amazing when I go back and forth between reading something like this or, reading even Xi Jinping's The Governance of China, or, anything else Vijay and the Tricontinental Institute have written about the development of socialist countries, and how exciting and exhilarating that is to read, versus, boring technical grad school homework, or, the isolated facts that you read in the bourgeois academy. Like, this stuff is groundbreaking. This stuff is showing us, China is showing us that a better world is possible. It literally is. There's no more denying it anymore, right? We have a country who's abolished poverty. who's used central economic planning to industrialize, raise living standards, build high-speed trains in between all the major cities, which also then connects all the major sectors of economic power and connects rural, more impoverished areas with the cities or with the areas where there's more industry and manufacturing, which, you know, in the rural Midwest, I don't live in the rural Midwest anymore. I live in a city in the Midwest, but I grew up in the rural Midwest. It would be amazing if a lot of the towns in the rural Midwest had high-speed trains connecting them to Chicago, right? Or even New York and the major centers of economic power, not only for traveling and for tourism, but the transportation of goods and the development of infrastructure in the economy. This would be huge for us in the Midwest and the South, especially the South, you know, like Appalachia, where they didn't have the same development of industry, partially because they had the slavery and the Confederacy for years. And, you know, there's not a lot of infrastructure, and, you know, the water supply is very dirty and unsafe. How's everybody doing? Nice emote. By the way, you can become a Twitch subscriber, and people know this. If you're a Twitch subscriber, you can send emotes. You can send custom emotes that like have me in a wrestling singlet flexing with like the communist hammer and sickle behind me. There's emotes of Carlos, and you can use those in the chat. Somebody in the chat is a subscriber. You should throw some of those emotes on there right now so I can point or show people what they are. And then we also have that on YouTube now. So if you like watching our live streams and our videos on YouTube more than Twitch, which there are a lot more people who watch on YouTube than Twitch, it's just the way it is right now, you can now become a member. And not only do members get emotes, but they also get priority in the chat. So like people can send super chats, right? Chats that have money attached to them, donations attached to them. And if you send a super chat and ask a question, I'll usually answer it. But if you're a member, if you're someone who helps donate and fund our project consistently, I will give priority to your comment whenever I can. I can see that you're a member when you leave a comment in the chat. And also I can see that you're a member if you leave emotes too, obviously. So then not only that, but $10 Patreon supporters, members, and subscribers also get a shout out once a week on the stream. And if you're a $10 member, you get a free Journal of American Socialist Studies ebook. So there's a lot of incentive to just be a $10 one because that's where you get the best benefit. You get a $10 ebook, an ebook that costs $10 anyways. So you get that for being a $10 patron or YouTube member. And yeah, I just thought I'd promote that because I never do self-promotion and we need to get better at it. Not self-promotion, website promotion. Silly me. Grew up on a farm in Troy, Ohio. Oh, there's a town called Troy in Wisconsin too. In the early 90s. Excuse me, one sec, Cobra. I need some water. In the early 90s, when I was a teenager, we got all excited because we could finally order a pizza. It took 2 hours to be delivered. It was a big deal on the farm. That's crazy. I believe it, though. The other day, not the other day, but like, I guess it was like 4 years ago now. But I went back to my hometown. I went back to this rural community in Wisconsin where I grew up. And me and my friends were out in the middle of nowhere. It was somewhere, I can't remember exactly where we were, but in a very, very rural area. And I was trying to get somewhere else or go home. And I just instinctively, used to living in the city for 4 years in college, I just tried to order an Uber, right? I figured in the time that I had been in college, Ubers had just spread everywhere. And you could order an Uber or a Lyft to anywhere you wanted, and it could take you anywhere in the world. And all my friends laughed at me. They're like, there ain't no Ubers out here. I'm like, okay. So yeah, infrastructure and the services that are available in surrounding people in the cities are not in rural areas. And connecting rural areas to the cities with trains would lead to a lot of economic development. Capitalism breeds innovation. Yes. I mean, at first, free competition does create, innovation and incentivize innovation in commerce, innovation in the production of surplus value, which just means, innovation and production in general, in some ways. Although, the development of capitalism is never super rational in any way. But then once you have the qualitative shift in capitalism, once you have this qualitative change from the stage of free competition, free market competition, into its monopoly stage, its imperialist stage, where monopolies, cartels, syndicates, trusts, and banks, and industrial capitalist monopolies who control raw material production, start to dominate markets. They start to use intellectual property to prevent innovation, prevent competitors from competing. They block entry to the market. They make it super hard to compete with them. They do planned obsolescence, where like Apple will create phones that break earlier on purpose because they know that they dominate the market, and you'll have to go back and buy more products from them. Washing machines and dryers. A washing machine mechanic, or a mechanic who works with washing machines, repairs washing machines, told me and my parents once that they used to last for 40 years at a time. But now they're created with the cheapest parts possible because they'll break and then you'll have to buy a new one. This happens because of monopolization and the lack of competition, which stems from the development of capitalism and the development of monopolies and the concentration of capital that we were talking about earlier. As capitalist competition, free market competition, one of the bases of capitalism's early development, dialectically transforms into its opposite over time. Free competition becomes its opposite, monopoly and domination of the market by a few concentrated firms, or combines. Capitalist combines, not the agricultural machine for harvesting wheat or whatever. I'm not very good at agronomy. But yeah, it's the opposite of what people say, that capitalism incentivizes innovation. Maybe in its early years in some ways, although it's still irrational. And although, the Soviet Union and China using economic planning still industrialized faster than capitalism could. It does breed innovation in some ways, in that if you find an innovative way to produce, right, if you're able to improve a machine in the Industrial Revolution that produces commodities, you're going to be able to outproduce competitors and make more money while spending less on the cost of labor. So your production costs will go down, and the amount of money you can make and the amount of commodities you can produce will go up. So that innovation's incentivized. But, as capitalism reaches its monopoly stage, it becomes the opposite. Companies try and prevent innovation so they can be the only commodity producer on the market. Capitalism breeds a $10 package of eggs. Yes, and that's the other thing is competition forces prices down, right? Competition makes it so capitalists have to keep prices at a certain level. Otherwise, everybody will just go buy commodities from another capitalist, right? If your competitor, if I'm selling eggs at $2 a dozen, and I have a competitor who's selling them at 50 cents a dozen, even if my eggs are superior, a lot of people are going to go buy the cheaper eggs. And I'm probably going to have to drive my price down. And if I drive my price too high, my customers will start to go away and more customers will go to the other guy's eggs. But if I have a giant egg producing company that also controls all the means of transport and the methods of transporting the eggs to the stores, and I also own a lot of the stores that sell my eggs, and I control basically the entire market for eggs, using a giant capitalist conglomerate that works together with the banks and is heavily financed by banks who also profit off this. And I control the entire market for eggs. I can drive prices up much higher, right? Because there's no competitors and there's nobody who can enter the market. right? If anybody wants to compete with me in the insane quantity of eggs that I produce and my control over the stores and the means of transport that are necessary to sell eggs, it's going to cost a lot. The cost of entry into the egg market, the cost of entry to buy the means of production and the labor necessary to produce and sell eggs is going to go up and up and up. The more that the market is controlled by conglomerates. So that leads to less competition, less ability for smaller firms to keep up, more monopolization, and thus more artificially inflated prices, meaning prices inflated over commodity prices, inflated over the labor value contained in those commodities, measured in time. And I've been talking about the labor theory of value a lot lately, talking about prices in relation to labor value and labor content, which I didn't used to discuss that much because I didn't know, how to defend the labor theory of value, I guess. Because the thing about the labor theory of value is when Marx is writing about it, when Marx is using it as the basis for his analysis in Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3, it was the widely accepted economic theory at the time, right? A lot of people today portray the labor theory of value as if it was created by Marx, as if Marx was the first person to come up with this so that he could say capitalism necessitates exploitation. But the labor theory of value was created by the classical economists who were in favor of capitalism. In fact, Adam Smith and David Ricardo were two of the major proponents of it and two of the people who helped develop it and found it as a scientific method of analyzing the economy and analyzing capitalism. And they're considered the fathers of capitalism, right? Adam Smith is still, you'll still have capitalist ideologues today who tell you to read Adam Smith. And it's like, you read Adam Smith, dummy, and then read Marx. It'll be really interesting and you'll come out a socialist. But either way, the labor theory of value stemmed from capitalist political economy, from bourgeois economics. Marx just took the labor theory of value that they created, which did have, does have a lot of scientific value to it, and a lot of analytical value. And Marx took it to its conclusions. He finished the analysis. Right? Adam Smith and David Ricardo missed a lot of things in their analysis, which Marx criticizes systematically and shows not just where they went astray, where they were wrong, but exactly how they went wrong and what misconceptions caused them to go wrong. But he takes this labor theory of value analysis to its conclusions and shows that capitalism necessitates exploitation. Right? If all value is created by labor, and the capitalists are constantly growing, they're constantly accumulating more and more assets, more and more capital, more and more wealth, then they must be exploiting the labor of workers, right? They must be paying the workers less money than what the workers create, less value than what they create. Otherwise, this accumulation, which is clearly happening, we can see it with our own eyes, would be impossible. So he uses the labor theory of value to prove exploitation, which Adam Smith and David Ricardo, when they were using the labor theory of value, if they ever, got close to saying, or realizing that exploitation was going on in the labor process or production process, they would just explain it away or stop the analysis there. And just be like, just assume that accumulation and profits were created by the capitalists themselves. When in fact it's created by the labor of workers and then appropriated, stolen by the capitalists. So neoclassical economics, which is why I bring up this article, my newest article on MidwesternMarx.com, which I'm putting in the chat right now. Neoclassical economics comes about at this point, right? Neoclassical econ comes about as an answer to Marxism because Marx has taken the labor theory of value, taken classical political economy to essentially its conclusion in many ways. He's answered a lot of the major questions of classical political economy, and he's systematically showed where the classical political economists went astray. So, in order to defend capitalism at this point, you can no longer use the labor theory of value. You accept the labor theory of value, you also accept exploitation because Marx proved that in Capital. So this is when neoclassical economics comes about, based on the utility theory of value, or what might as well be called the subjective theory of value, where they throw out the labor theory of value completely and claim that the price of products, and thus the value of products, is determined by consumer demand, how much utility the consumer sees in the product, related to the supply of that product in the market. Now, there's no way of proving this, right? All they do is take the price point of a certain commodity, or the average price of a commodity, put it on a graph and draw 2 lines through it, supply and demand, and there's no way to prove that these lines exist, or quantify these lines in any way, because you can't quantify consumer demand. You can't express it numerically. So the curves are essentially meaningless, and the price point is largely determined by the labor content, or correlated to the labor content within that commodity. But this is the sort of price astrology, the sort of bourgeois capitalist ruling class illusion that's created in order to distract from the fact that Marx had taken classical political economy, the labor theory of value, which does have a lot of analytical and scientific value, and proved capitalist exploitation, and proved that capitalist production is the production of surplus value created by surplus labor, the extra unpaid labor of workers that's stolen from them by the capitalists who own the means of production. So that's basically what this article is about, defending the labor theory of value using the work of Paul Cockshott and others, but especially the work of Paul Cockshott, talking about how neoclassical economics and this utility theory of value have influenced Marxists in the modern day, especially in the West, and even caused a lot of Marxist economists to dismiss the labor theory of value, right? Claim that labor, when combined with nature, is not the source of all value. And in fact, this utility theory of value is actually correct, even though there's no scientific proof or evidence for it. It's just price astrology, like I said. And there are ways of measuring and testing the labor theory of value scientifically, right? Which is one of the things that makes a theory scientific. It needs to be testable. It needs to be observable. You need to be able to set up data models or data tables, or use hard evidence from the real world to explain why this model is effective. So that's what Paul Cockshott does here, and I detail it in this article, explaining how labor content measured in time closely correlates to price, and explaining how the demand and supply utility theory of value is unscientific and is untestable, and therefore Marxist economists should not throw it out. Also, this transition away from classical political economy towards neoclassical political economy that comes post-Marx is based on this subjective theory of value, right? Value is subjective. It's determined by the demand that individuals have for commodities, right? The value of a commodity in the market is just determined by how much people want it. It's determined by the use value of the commodity, even though that's qualitative, even though that is subjective. It's a subjective thing determined by individuals that you can't put a number value on. So there's no way it could determine price, but they claim it determines price. And this fits perfectly with the neoliberal bourgeois ideology and the neoliberal bourgeois culture and narrative about society, that we're all just individuals. And that there can be no knowledge that's held objectively, no objective truths that are held in common and understood by everybody, no objective analysis, no scientific analysis of society. There's only the individual experiences of individual people who are isolated from each other. That's all that matters, is the individual's demand for consumer goods, for commodities. That's what value is in society. Not labor, not concrete human labor, which can be measured concretely with labor time, or average labor time used to produce certain commodities. So the transition to neoclassical economics is really a transition to subjectivism individualism, neoliberalism in economics, in order to, or which I call the purest expression of the capitalist ruling class ideology in academia, in the field of economics. And it's very, very similar to the purest expression of bourgeois philosophy in the field of philosophy, in the Capitalist Academy in philosophy, which is, postmodernism, or that's what I argue in this paper. Citing the work of Gabriel Rockhill a lot, and citing the connection and involvement of the CIA and arms of the U.S. State Department and arms of U.S. finance capital. Actually, the State Department resisted postmodernism at first, but later embraced it when the CIA had promoted it and proved that it was successful in promoting capitalism. But either way, postmodernism stresses the idea that there are no meta-narratives, right? There are no objective truths. No objective truths about history or historical development that can be held in common, right? There can be no objective understanding of value, right? We can't understand commonly as a people that labor is what creates value when it's combined with nature. Value is subjective, and it's determined by the subjective desires of individuals. There's nothing objective. The scientific method is no longer the way to observe objective reality, or get as close as we can to understanding objective reality in our minds, because there is no objective reality. It's all just subjective. Ooh, individualism. This is postmodernism, and it relates directly to this subjective utility theory of value invented by the neoclassical economists to replace classical political economy after Marx destroys it. So that's the article I just finished. I really, really like it. I'm really, really proud of it. I'm sure there's mistakes in it. I want to talk to Dr. Paul Cockshott about the themes in this article and about his work that I cited in this article. And he actually just posted a new lecture on YouTube, which I got like 25 minutes into today, before I had to put it away, sadly, and finish my homework, which then took me 8 hours. But he just published Information Entropy and Capitalist Mass Production, which is about the labor theory of value, the historical development of the labor theory of value, how it came into being, and its scientific or materialist basis. So I'm still learning more about this stuff, and I'm sure I'll have to write a follow-up to this article at some point. But I'm still really proud of it. I think it's good. I think it has a lot of good research in it. And then I had Carlos read over the part about postmodernism and philosophy, which, doesn't mean it's perfect. It's not like Carlos has a fully encyclopedic knowledge of philosophy, although he's pretty dang close. But that was the part that I was less comfortable with, because I've studied neoclassical economics in college. I've studied bourgeois right-wing economics in college. My professor was the chairwoman of the local Republican Party in town. So I've studied this kind of economic science, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on it, and of course a pretty decent grasp on Marxism, so I can compare the labor theory of value in Marxist economics to the utility theory of value in neoclassical economics, and also compare that to classical economics, which preceded it. But I didn't have as good or as strong, as dominant of a grasp on the history of philosophy and postmodernism. So that's where Carlos helped me in, or came in and helped me out. Honestly, we should have both put our names on this article because we kind of co-wrote it. But yeah, it's I say there's mistakes in it because it's like 35 pages long, and I'm sure I said something in it that was not entirely correct. And people, not a lot of people, but a couple people commented that the title seems editorialized, or the article seems editorialized, and yeah, that was my intention with that article, and I hope I sent it in the chat. But I didn't want to write another academic article. I didn't want to write another, strictly scholarly article, because that's what I've been doing for my healthcare administration graduate program every day, reading really, really, really dry healthcare literature or medical literature, and writing really, really dry academic peer-reviewed articles about healthcare and the administration of healthcare. And there are some really, really good articles, academic articles already, peer-reviewed scholarly stuff from people like Radhika Desai, which I cite in my article about neoclassical economics, that debunks neoclassical economics and shows the value of the labor theory. So I wanted to write something that was more fun to read, that was more concise, that was more editorialized, that, you know, makes it clear what my opinion on this is. That shits on neoclassical political economy and people who are just mouthpieces for the capitalist ruling class. People like Milton Friedman, who claim to be genius academics, but are really just propped up by money from the ruling class because they're professing this ideology, this academic philosophy that is, or this philosophy of political economy that is the purest expression of the capitalist ruling class. And, you know, also in this article, I say that Alfred Marshall, who's known as the father of neoclassical economics, and the inventor of the supply and demand utility theory of value, I say that he pulled the supply and demand curves out of his ass like 4 times. No, it's actually like twice, but still, you know, why would you want to read a long, detailed piece of academic literature when you can read a long, detailed piece of literature based on academic literature that says Cockshot turns the demand curve given by Marshall into an algebraic equation and finds that the points on the curve have no material origin and are entirely senseless, as they were almost surely just made up and drawn arbitrarily by Marshall on a graph. Similar results are deduced in the analysis of the supply curve, showing that without a doubt this entire theory, foundational to the neoclassical school and modern economic thought, was pulled straight out of Alfred Marshall's ass without a shred of real evidence attached to it. So yeah, that's an example of what this article's like if you read the whole thing. Like I said, I wanted to explain neoclassical econ and postmodern philosophy in a way that's entertaining and quick and easily digestible, partially because too, and I mentioned this in the article, I made a whole segment on it. I thought about leaving it out, but I was like, no, it's important, even though it has to do with TikTok and it's kind of silly. But there on TikTok, of course, there were a lot of young people from working class families who were drawn to Marxism and who I was reaching with Marxist political and economic education. But there were also all these things like the neo-Marxists, right? There was this neo-Marxist TikTok hype house. It was called a hype house. And it was just a bunch of kids talking about neo-Marxism, which is basically postmodernism. Thinkers like Derrida and Foucault and a lot of these French thinkers or critical theorists, Horkheimer and Adorno, people like that. And there were also these people who called themselves post-leftists, right? We're leftists, we're Marxists, and that we embrace Marx's method of analysis, but we reject socialism, right? We think there's no hope and that capitalism will reign forever. And these people took a lot of the energy away from the class conscious young people, the young people from working families who were interested in Marxism, because the post-leftists and the neo-Marxists would be super condescending, right? And they would be super insulting, and they would make fun of people for believing in the labor theory of value or, you know, buying into Marx's meta-narrative about class struggle being what drives history. Or the, you know, reject the labor theory of value. Maybe I already said that. But basically claiming to be Marxist while not actually being Marxist, while, you know, being neoliberals in principle. And this is what Gabriel Rockhill dissects in his stuff about postmodernism in the Frankfurt School, which I love so much. And that was like a final piece of the puzzle for me, right? Because I never understood what these neo-Marxists were really saying or what these post-leftists were saying, or I understood kind of what they were saying, but I didn't see the truth in it. I didn't see, you know, it didn't help me explain the world. Their philosophies and theories didn't help explain the world the way Lenin's Imperialism does. And I didn't understand why they would scoff at the work of someone like Lenin for being too simplistic and not complex enough. not as intelligent as the stuff thought up in a CIA-funded think tank somewhere in France. So when Rockhill showed that this philosophy, is just pseudo-leftism, pseudo-socialism, pseudo-Marxism, pretending to advocate for the working class while actually advocating neoliberalism, giving the aesthetic of being radical while supporting the existing ruling class, it was the last piece of the puzzle for me. And it helped me to inform a lot of young people interested in Marxism and explain to them that these neo-Marxists and these postmodernists and these post-leftists were essentially just neoliberals masquerading as Marxists, and there was no reason to listen to everything they said or second guess yourself just because they're super condescending towards working people and working class conscious Marxists. So that is why I wrote this article. Because not only, are the postmodernists and neo-Marxists like that, not only do they discourage people from getting into Marxism, but neoclassical economics and libertarians do that as well, right? They mock people for believing in the labor theory of value. They mock people for believing that Marx proved exploitation, or that Marx said anything valuable, or that his work is still relevant today. And it is still relevant today. Of course, Marx did prove exploitation. Of course, the labor theory of value does still have scientific use and analytical uses today, much more so than any of the analytical models like the utility theory of value devised by the neoclassicals. But, the neoclassicals are funded by a bunch of corporate NGOs and a bunch of Koch brothers think tanks who are also controlling or influencing a lot of the academies, a lot of the colleges, the universities who produce information and scholarly work and theories of political economy and politics. So they're able to, silence a lot of Marxists and act condescendingly towards Marxists without a lot of scientific value backing up their own theories, right? Without a lot to defend the substance of their theories, of which there's little. So again, that's the reason I wrote that article about postmodernism and neoclassical economics. So people newly getting into Marx, or people who have been getting into Marxism for a while, but have been confused about neoclassical economics promoted by libertarians, or postmodernism promoted by post-leftists. Now Now you'll be able to distinguish that from Marxism, orthodox Marxism. Postmodern neo-Marxist, yes. This is how you can learn about those postmodern neo-Marxists Jordan Peterson's been warning you about. And you'll actually learn that postmodernism is the opposite of Marxism, or totally different than Marxism. And Jordan Peterson is a liar. He's not a liar. I think he's just, well, no, he is a liar. But I think in that case, he's just confused. Because it's so interesting how it works. Because the postmodernists call themselves Marxists, right? Like these postmodernist thinkers like Foucault, while ultimately promoting, liberalism and liberal ideology, they claim to be Marxists, right? So then Jordan Peterson looks at their ideology, their neoliberal individualistic ideology, and he says, I don't like that. But he associates that with Marxism. He thinks that postmodernism is Marxism because they're calling themselves Marxists, even though they're funded by the CIA. And then he says postmodern neo-Marxism is terrible. And what he's actually criticizing is postmodernism, which is, the purest intellectual expression of the ruling capitalist class, like I said. And he thinks he's criticizing Marxism, which is a critique of liberalism and capitalist society. It's just hilarious that guy is, considered the greatest public intellectual of our time, right? This guy who claims to be able to critique Marxism, but he's only read the Communist Manifesto, is considered the greatest intellectual of our time. Capitalism just creates a theater for intellectual frauds, right? People who speak confidently and say things that sound good, but aren't necessarily backed up by data and evidence, because they never have to really defend their theories against anybody who's going to come at them, come at their foundations, because they're protected by the various libertarian NGOs and think tanks that pay them. Read Jane Mayer's Dark Money, by the way. That's the last thing I'm going to say about this article, the one I wrote recently. One of the citations in my Neoclassical Economics Postmodern Philosophy article is the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which I believe she's a liberal or Democrat journalist, definitely leans liberal, and really only criticizes the Koch brothers and right-wing think tanks in this book, where she could, come after a lot of neoliberal left-wing think tanks. But in this book, she talks about the infrastructure set up by the Koch brothers over the last 30, 40 years that allows them to funnel money, which, they often consider to be charitable donations and they get a tax write-off for, into the academy, into controlling colleges, right? And they have these institutions, these NGOs that they and their billionaire buddies throw a bunch of money into, which then donate to these colleges, charitable donations, in return for the colleges hiring neoclassical economists, people who believe in trickle down, oftentimes trained up at places like the University of Chicago, which is one of the hubs for this neoclassical ideology, heavily funded by the Koch brothers since its inception. Its inception was funded by the Koch brothers, or its popularization. So the Koch brothers have built this infrastructure for funding and pushing ruling class ideology in the academy, trickle-down economics in the academy, as well as, other institutions of education at every level, including high school and elementary, and the media, and anything that produces information. Any important producers of information in society is likely controlled by what Jane Mayer calls the Kochtopus, this infrastructure for campaign funding too. That's the other thing that it's used for. But basically just ideological and cultural influence in order to support capitalism. And even though this book is written by a liberal journalist, like I said, it's very good at dissecting capitalism, or the way that capitalist ideology is promoted by the ruling capitalist class. Yeah. Now I feel like I got to bring up a base and superstructure picture real quick. And I'm also going to pull it up in this article that I wrote, even though I said I'm done talking about it. So you see here, the relations of production are capitalist relations of production. The ruling class is the capitalist class who owns capital, and the working class are the wage laborers who sell their labor to the capitalists in a market for a wage in order to survive and buy back the means of subsistence, the commodities they need to survive, from the capitalists who hoard them. And this gives capitalists the wealth and power and ability to control the superstructure. Now, the superstructure is everything in society that's not directly related to production: art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, education. Now, these things are still related to production, right? And you have like the production of information, which produces different aspects of the superstructure. But that is what the capitalist class looks to control, right? So the Kochtopus that Jane Mayer analyzes in her book Dark Money is basically just a giant institution, a giant method, a form of infrastructure, if you will, infrastructure for producing information and not material commodities, for controlling the superstructure, for influencing the legal system and politics by lobbying the government, controlling the media, controlling the education system and the academy, pushing postmodernist philosophy, pushing certain kinds of religion like the prosperity gospel, pushing individualistic money-based culture, pull yourself up by your bootstraps culture, and other stuff like that. So yeah, that's how neoclassical econ and postmodern philosophy have been pushed and have become dominant in the academy and have come to underpin all of the social sciences that we study in the West, despite the fact that they have no scientific basis and they have no scientific merits. And they can be debunked by reason and logic and the scientific method and argumentation and objective analysis, material analysis. Despite this, they've come to dominate in the academy because they're backed up by so much ruling class money, which I also go over in that article. Please read the article. I'm real proud of it. Leave a comment too. Because I can see the statistics of who's reading or how many people have read my article, but the only real thing I can see or interact with is comments, because there's no likes on midwesternmarks.com. You can't like an article. So if you read it or read part of it or plan to read it and you leave a comment, I'll love you forever. That also helps boost our website. I've been rambling. 1 a.m. late boy Marxist hours. Yeah. Like I said, I was up all day doing homework. Did homework nonstop today, 8 hours. And, I was just ready to chill and hang out and do a stream with y'all and just ramble. I didn't want to do any work anymore. I was ready to relax. Even though I guess this is considered work. It's work that I love and enjoy. And I refused to not get a stream in today. So make sure you like, share, and comment on the 1 a.m. stream. Become a member of the Midwestern Marks YouTube, or become a Twitch subscriber, or become a Patreon supporter if you want to support us financially, and help support our project. Thank you all very much. Solidarity. Late boy Marxist hours. Were the Berlin protests really going that crazy? Which Berlin protests? I didn't even see that. I seem to recall John D. Rockefeller, founder of the General Education Board of Education, which, by the way, and we were talking about the Rockefeller monopoly that emerged in the early 20th century earlier today when we were talking about Lenin's imperialism. This is a perfect example of base and superstructure. You have Rockefeller, one of the leading members of the capitalist ruling class, being appointed founding the General Board of Education. So, a lot of the public education in our society has been handcrafted since the beginning by industrialists, by capitalists. And in fact, the American elementary school education system, which I also talk about this in my article, by the way. I know I keep bringing that up, but I am quite proud of it, was based on the idea of factory schools, meaning schools that not only kept kids busy and took care of them so the parents could be off working in the factories, but also trained up a generation of youth or the next generation of people to be workers, to be cogs in the machine, right? Unless you can go on to higher education where they'll teach you to be a manager of the machine. The elementary education system will train you up to be a cog in the machine, to teach you to think uncritically, accept your place in life, accept the system around you is static, unchanging, and something that could never be improved. And I mean, this was admittedly the purpose of public education when it was first enacted. And you have capitalists like John D. Rockefeller, who were quoted saying things like this, as proof that this was the original purpose of the education system, and still is today. Saying things like, I don't want a nation of philosophers, I want a nation of workers, right? They were pretty honest about it back then. Now they try and lie about it and say, everybody's their own individual, unique snowflake, and all they need to do is pull themselves up by their bootstraps and everyone will be rich somehow, and all the homeless people will go away if we just have enough personal responsibility. Back then, they were a little more honest about it. Yeah, we want an education system that produces a nation of subservient workers. The higher education system can teach you to be a manager of capital or a manager of workers, but that's only for the wealthy who can afford it. Of course, that's also something I talk about in my article about neoclassical econ and postmodernism, that, you know, these ideologies are taught to people who can afford college, people who don't go into, you know, manual labor, the blue collar industries, agricultural work or industrial work right away, or, you know, into the service industry right away out of high school. But instead are able to afford college or take on debt to try and, you know, afford college and get to the middle class or the professional managerial class or even the capitalist class. But, you know, that's where they train the managers of capitalist society. And that's why all the social sciences are underpinned by neoclassical economics, which is just, you know, capitalism, market worship economics that might as well be a dogmatic religion that worships capitalism, because they want everyone to believe that. They want everybody in every field of study, every future manager of capitalism, to believe that this system is the best. And we have to just trust the market to allocate everything best. There's a good second thought video about the neoconservative money machine and how it influences the media and the academy. We'll have to react to that sometime. I'm interested to see that right now. Because I feel like that is the kind of video that JT of Second Thought could do better than anyone else. You know, not only using his really good production value, but just his style and, you know, his, like, he's read a decent amount of theory, right? He's getting into theory and Lenin, but he's probably been at it for like a year or two, right? Versus there are people with a deeper grasp on the classics, right? And classic Marxist theory and principles and Marxist economics and things like the labor theory of value, you know, the theoretical foundations of the Marxist method and the Marxist worldview. But you know, Second Thought has a decent grasp on that stuff. But what he's really, 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 really good at is analyzing specific phenomena in the modern world, in the modern day, in modern culture, in modern neoliberal capitalist society, looking at things like how the bourgeoisie, how the imperialist capitalist finance capitalists control the media and control public opinion. I'll search education. How conservatives co-opted Christianity. See, stuff like this, right? Like how the ruling class controls the superstructure. How the ruling class controls things like religion to control the people, and then reinforce support for capitalism, the economic base. Is it the problem with American education? Someone let me know. I'm kind of down to watch this video right now. I don't know how much longer we'll go after that. I'm kind of running out of energy and getting tired, but yeah. All those good jobs like coding are just ultimately a cringe factory. And a lot of the basic coding jobs, my buddy who's in engineering was telling me this weekend, and I was telling y'all I had like a 3-hour conversation with him about engineering, and more than 3 hours, like an 8-hour conversation about the state of the economy and development of the economy and engineering. And he said that AI is probably gonna dispense with or automate a lot of the easiest programming jobs, a lot of the easiest, more simplistic coding jobs, because coding is ultimately a language, and AI technology can understand foreign languages or all languages and have access to source code, the totality of source code that normally coders would have to manually get and enter in. So they're not inventing anything new. Usually they're drawing from, what already exists, this source code, and inputting it into something. So he was saying the AI technology is probably going to be able to do that and automate away those jobs, which, we've been told to learn to code, to learn to program for the last however many years. because that's this booming industry, and now those jobs are being automated too. Those jobs created by the technological revolution are now being taken away by automation, just like the jobs created by the industrial revolution are now being taken away by automation. The one I was thinking of is called "Why is U.S. Media Becoming More Right-Wing?" Okay, interesting. Now I'm tempted to watch this one though, because we were talking about education specifically. If this one doesn't have anything to do with what we've been talking about, I'll go to the one you're saying, why U.S. media is becoming more right-wing. But I kind of want to watch the one about education for now. We'll give that one a try, give it a shot, give it a second thought.
This episode is made possible by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. In the United States, we like to pride ourselves on being the best at things. We spend more money than any other nation on our military, healthcare, and education. Unfortunately, simply throwing money at things doesn't make you the best at them. Our military, despite having the budget of the next 10 biggest spenders combined, is tremendously wasteful and is...
Okay, quick correction. I mean, the U.S. does kind of throw money at healthcare, but only in terms of Medicare and Medicaid. And Medicare and Medicaid costs are only artificially inflated because of price gouging by insurance companies and for-profit healthcare companies. They're only somewhat inefficient and bloated because the private sector of the healthcare system is so inefficient and bloated. But Medicare and Medicaid, the two public parts of the healthcare sector, are the most efficient and the parts of the healthcare sector that people approve of most or are most satisfied with. But it's not necessarily that the U.S. is throwing money at healthcare, and that's why we spend the most money on it. It's because capitalism is making everybody sick, giving everybody mental and physical health issues like exhaustion and depression and social isolation, anxiety, whatever else. And then the healthcare system sells them pills, sells them relief, essentially sells them things that can mask the symptoms. And there are things, that the healthcare system produces and does, services they give that, really improve people's health and allow them to live longer. Modern medicine's amazing, but, now the life expectancy in the US is decreasing because our healthcare system isn't necessarily based on making people better. It's not based on making people better. It's based on making a profit. So I guess it's not necessarily that, we're throwing a bunch of money at healthcare. It's that these conglomerates, these monopolies dominating healthcare are ripping everybody off and forcing us to spend more money than every other country in the world on healthcare for worse health outcomes and for worse population health overall.
Constantly used as a destabilizing force in regions we wish to dominate or exploit. Our healthcare system, despite occupying the world's #1 spot for per capita expenditure, is routinely ranked the worst in the developed world in terms of access, efficiency, and effectiveness. While each of these topics deserves its own video, in this episode, we're going to focus on the U.S. education system, why it's failing our students and teachers, and what we can do to fix it. Think back to your time in school. What do you remember? Early mornings, long windowless hallways punctuated by locked doors, a strictly regimented schedule. Your school life was dictated by the authority of the teacher, who conditioned you with countless commands every day. Sit down, open your textbook to page 10, stop talking, line up. You were punished for speaking to classmates, making a joke, or coming in a single minute late. You had to get permission to use the restroom. Class started with a bell and ended with a bell. There's another kind of institution that follows a similar structure. It shouldn't come as a surprise that in the US, many of the same architects who designed our prisons also designed our schools. For many of us, school is an unpleasant memory. Sure, most of us had fun with friends we made in class, but that fun was exclusively outside of school hours.
And until I started researching, the origin of public education under capitalism, and this, these factory school system, or this factory school system that emerged under capitalism, the system of public education based on educating a subservient working class rather than, educating an intelligent population of critical thinking people. I used to think it was like an anarchist tendency that back in the day I just hated school, or I hated, I loved learning, but I hated sitting in a desk all day, being told what to do all day, acting essentially as a drone all day under the control of some supervisor who may or may not give a crap about me. Right. And I always thought it was an anarchist tendency I had to just hate the fact that recess was taken away from us in middle school. In middle school, when you're freaking 13 or 14 years old. right? You have to sit inside at a desk all day, 8 hours a day, and you're not allowed to go outside, socialize, and play with your friends, which of course is training you at an extremely early age, getting you ready for the capitalist world, for an 8 hour a day desk job or whatever. And you know, this factory school system has its basis in reality. I mean, this is the reality, and it has its basis in history, right? The public education system emerged as a way to train up a subservient working class, as a way to essentially make you another brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd says. And, you know, to not analyze the education system as part of the superstructure would be anti-Marxist, and would be to not do a full Marxist analysis of the system, right? So it's not just anarchists who think that the school system is turning us into drones or is controlling us. And I don't know. And like, if you look at the Soviet educational psychologist Lev Vygotsky, or watch the interview, the podcast that we did with Curry Mallet of the Liberation School about Lev Vygotsky, the Soviet Union had all these revolutionary ideas about education, right? About adapting the education system to the needs of the students. And doing things like finding the talents and finding the hidden abilities of students, even those who are disabled, physically or mentally disabled, or who suffer differences in their cognitive or physical ability. Because a lot of times those students, you know, while unable to do things that other students are able to do, the average student is able to do, they have special abilities. They can do things that the average student can't do because they have a different life experience, and, you know, yeah, and that leads to different skill sets. And Vygotsky said that the school system should be adapted to allow students to flourish based on their specific talents and their specific interests and their specific desires. You know, basically the opposite of this factory education system, this standardized drone clone creating system in the US and the West. And, you know, a lot of that those ideas in educational psychology stemmed from the Soviet Union, from the first socialist experiment. And Lev Vygotsky made so many breakthroughs in educational psychology that he's taught today in the West. He's taught in West Europe and the US education system. But everything he said that was revolutionary, everything he said about, you know, allowing the talents of unique students and unique individuals to flourish, and, you know, everything he wrote combating ableism in the education system and promoting the skill sets of folks who are considered disabled, is torn out of his work when it's taught in the US, literally. It was systematically reviewed by US regulators and US politicians and people on the General Board of Education, like John D. Rockefeller, these capitalists, corporatists, and was removed in place of the, as we said, the factory education system that creates working class drones.
Odds are the memory of your education itself is pretty negative. Besides the experience of attending American school, the outcomes the system produces are also less than stellar. Despite our cultural obsession with getting American students to perform well in standardized testing, our scores fall squarely in the middle of the pack compared to other industrialized nations. This single-mindedness also has a more critical consequence. By demanding our teachers simply prepare students for testing rather than fostering an actually effective learning environment, we end up with students who not only forget everything they crammed into their heads immediately after taking the test, but who also lack the skills required to learn effectively. The students aren't the only ones suffering. The US has exceptionally high teacher turnover due to low pay and long hours, and compounding the problem, a teacher shortage. So, to sum up the problem, our students are unhappy, perform poorly, and don't gain the critical skills they need. And our teachers are unhappy, overworked, and we don't have enough of them to meet a growing need. A country depends on its young people, those who will grow up and take the reins from the previous generations. So why are we failing them so badly? Before we get into some potential solutions, we need to understand the three main problems plaguing the American education system. These three problems are the system's outdatedness, its underfunding, and its privatization. The lack of funding and the rapid privatization of the education system go hand in hand. So let's start there. When you think of the average school, whether elementary, middle, or high school, you're generally thinking about a public institution. That is, a school that is federally funded and tasked with providing education to all people of the appropriate age in a given school district free of charge. Public schools have existed in the US since before it officially became a country. But the first board of education was established in Massachusetts in the year 1837. The person spearheading the education initiative, or its man, believed that public education was the best way to overcome poverty, bridge social gaps, and prepare young people to enter the workforce. The Federal Department of Education was established 30 years later, with the goal of standardizing and helping to implement education across the country. What may be surprising to some is that private schools actually predate public schools in the US. As early as the 1660s, individual teachers were offering their services to young people and adults as a way to supplement their income. This private schooling often took place in the evenings, and was less structured than typical day school. By the beginning of the American Revolution, private schools had become pretty well established and were favored by those who could afford their fees. Fast forward to more modern times, and, like with healthcare and infrastructure, we begin to see a problem with accelerating privatization. The practice of privatization is simple. It entails the handing off of once public responsibilities to privately owned companies. Since the 80s, there's been a consensus, a deeply flawed one, but a consensus nonetheless, that there's nothing the government can do that the private sector can't do better. The word better is doing some heavy lifting here. Private companies often get things done more quickly or with a greater profit, but what free market enthusiasts fail to realize is that the outcomes are incredibly damaging, as is the case with American healthcare, or extremely fragile, as evidenced by private infrastructure projects. Take the Texas power grid, for example. It's entirely deregulated. This allows them to cut costs and make a greater profit. It also sets them up for disaster, as we saw with the recent winter storm that completely knocked out the state's power and left millions stranded in freezing conditions. Of course, a crisis like this is considered an acceptable risk when there's a nice profit to be had. This free market logic has slowly seeped into the realm of education. Over the past couple of decades, various federal initiatives have provided parents the option of using federal funds to send their children to private schools, whether by providing so-called school choice vouchers or allowing for the possibility of school transfers, where students can move from low-performing schools to higher-performing private schools. This has led to a number of problems. The most obvious is that by spending federal money to incentivize parents to enroll their children in private school, they've robbed public schools of badly needed funding. Why spend money to move kids around when you could simply fund the schools that are designed to be funded by that money? Because of this practice, public schools face a vicious cycle. There's not enough money to pay teachers, so teachers leave, which leads to more students in each class, which overwhelms the remaining teachers. There's not enough money for school supplies or even basic school maintenance, which leads to unsafe learning environments. These problems compound over time, which makes the schools perform worse, which then suggests to the federal government that they're doing the right thing by incentivizing the move to private schools. Okay, but if the private schools perform better and the average parent can afford them, why not just abandon public schools? There are a few reasons.
And as the social democratic academic Naomi Klein writes about in her book Washington Bullets, not Washington Bullets, The Shock Doctrine. Washington Bullets is by Vijay Prashad. It's getting late here. My brain's getting fried. But what she writes about in The Shock Doctrine is the way that shock therapy, neoliberal shock therapy and privatization was induced on New Orleans and the state of Louisiana following Hurricane Katrina. So for those who know the story, you know what I'm about to say about this article, the promise of vouchers, which as Second Thought just explained, are basically government funds handed to people to pay for private schools that allow shareholders or owners or executives or whoever to make money. I don't know if can private schools be controlled by actual shareholders, or is that illegal? Does it have to be like executives collecting a salary? Either way, you know, they make a lot of profit for administrators and bureaucrats at the top. But after Hurricane Katrina basically wiped out all of the public schools in New Orleans, all of the government-funded, government-owned schools, Milton Friedman, you know, just a few years before he died, I believe. I don't know when he died. It was not long after 2005 when he wrote this, wrote an article urging George Bush to replace all of the destroyed public schools with private schools, with charter schools, and, you know, pay for them with vouchers, which is hilarious because Milton Friedman, his whole thing, his whole claim to fame is that he's anti-government. Right? The free market has to decide everything. Get the government out of our market. Unless you're giving people government money to pay for private school, right? Unless you're using or handing out government money to people that they can then funnel up to corporations, who Milton Friedman really serves and are really the only thing that he cares about. You know, he doesn't have any real principles when it comes to economics. And that's why he betrays his principles whenever it's convenient, right? Whenever it comes to the government doing something that aids the capitalist ruling class, Milton Friedman gives it 2 thumbs up. Whenever it comes to enacting welfare or healthcare or social security or food programs or anything that would help the workers, like a jobs guarantee or doing central economic planning, he says, oh no, the government inefficient. We need to trust the free market. Which is hilarious. But he wrote this op-ed to George Bush, encouraging them to replace all the public schools with private schools, and they did. So the disaster relief effort in Katrina involved replacing the public school system in Louisiana and especially New Orleans with private schools and charter schools, and the results have been disastrous. Some of you know, I got to see this firsthand because there was a pipeline at my school and my wrestling program between Louisiana and a lot of the schools in New Orleans with decent wrestling programs. and the college that I wrestled at. So a ton of my teammates, including my roommate today, grew up in New Orleans and lived through Katrina and experienced this firsthand. They experienced the deterioration, the destruction, and the closing of a lot of public schools, or tons of public schools that never came back after being destroyed in Katrina, and their replacement by these extremely expensive private schools charging like $40,000 in tuition a year. So now, you have these majority black, minority populated public schools in impoverished areas in Louisiana and New Orleans that are deteriorating and underfunded. And then you have these basically segregated by race and by class, by economic status, private schools where, kids have to pay $40,000 a year or whatever. So obviously it's only the rich kids from rich families who can get into these schools. And it's created an incredibly unequal and pay-to-play education system in New Orleans and Louisiana, which is currently ranks as like the 49th or 50th worst education system in the country. Right? It's been terrible for the average population, for the masses of people. And I have a lot of friends who went to public schools in Louisiana, and I have a lot of friends who went to private schools, and the difference in their experiences are insane. Right. And the ones who went to the private schools are aware of this. Like, we were all on the same wrestling team together. Like, by the time we graduated, everybody understood this, that or all the Louisiana kids understood that the experience of their friends who went to public schools was vastly different from them, from their experience paying $40,000 a year for high school. But this is the effect of privatization in education. And it's just crazy, and shows how opportunistic and vicious these capitalists are, that they pounced on a disaster, a horrific disaster like Katrina that destroyed all these schools, to take the opportunity and try and jump on privatizing everything, get rid of public education, get rid of any kind of government funding for the working class, and replace it with government funding for the ruling class. In the form of these vouchers. And then also thousands and thousands of teachers in New Orleans never got their jobs back. Right? A lot of the public education system employees were never rehired, and they were just permanently without a job because the public education system was wiped out and replaced with this new charter school system that's produced some of the worst results in the country, similar to our for-profit healthcare system. So there you go. That's where privatization leads you. Even though Milton Friedman claims privatization always leads to the most efficient and best results, he's lying.
Innate to how private schools operate, and some based on the responsibility of the federal government. First and foremost, it has been long established that the state has a responsibility to provide access to free education to every student. This is non-negotiable, at least for now. If public schools didn't exist, there would be students who could not afford to go to private school. Since education is a right, this is unacceptable. So for the time being, the federal government cannot reasonably get rid of public schools entirely. The other issues stem from the private schools themselves. By their very nature, private schools are not beholden to any kind of governance when it comes to what is taught within their walls. All they have to do is provide proof that their education meets basic educational standards. This has led to an upsurge in what can be considered reactionary, or as the schools prefer.
And I want to pause this to discuss, there are private schools in Louisiana, but private schools are different from charter schools. And there are a lot of charter schools in Louisiana, and a lot of private schools, I believe. I would have to look at the actual makeup of the schools. And not a lot of my analysis of this comes from subjective experience and my friends' experience, but some of it does too. It's not like this is my area of research focus, although I have read about it, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, and read Milton Friedman's piece on vouchers and other things about it. But charter schools are a different thing than private schools. They're publicly funded, but technically independent. So it's similar to, giving people vouchers to pay for schools that are just strictly private. It's public funding of schools that are independent and can pay enormous salaries to executives. They're probably not allowed to have shareholders attached to them. I don't know. I'll look that up. But it's basically public funding of public funding, not a scam, but yeah, basically a scam in education. More independent schools, only available to certain people that pay huge salaries to bureaucrats and administrators.
For traditional education. What this means in essence is that most private schools skew intensely religious, conservative, and insular. Their student body is overwhelmingly white, Christian, and wealthy. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a parent wanting their child to get a religious education. But the problem is, in the US, Christianity has been co-opted by conservatism. Gone are the days when people understood Jesus to be a brown communist from the Middle East, who railed against the rich and preached inclusion, decency, and the value of living humbly. Most American Christians have grafted the language of conservatism onto their faith. Homophobia, racism, unfettered free market economics, and a rabid hatred for anything that could be considered even remotely socialist. This is not by accident. The political right has adopted religious, patriotic language in an attempt to secure a large and dedicated voting bloc, evangelicals, and it's worked. In modern private schools, and I should know, I attended one, it's not uncommon to see PragerU videos shown in class. It's not uncommon to see economics classes that espouse the suicidal free market ideology of Friedman and Rand. History classes portray the U.S.
I don't know. I'm going to have to look up how charter schools are structured specifically and read on that, because that would be an interesting thing to know. That would be an interesting thing to know about the capitalist superstructure and capitalist education system, because it says here that stakeholders in the charter schools are parents, teachers, administrators, community members, and business people. But I don't know if that means the business people are technically allowed to, like own shares in the charter school. I don't think it works like that. I think they're probably just donors to the charter school, but of course they're getting something out of that. They're not just donors to that school for free out of the goodness of their hearts. So if anybody's an expert on charter schools, let me know in the chat, huh?
US as the good guy in every conflict, including those where we were clearly in the wrong. Today's supposedly Christian education would not be recognized as such by the Jesus of the Bible. Instead, it's a new religion, the religion of free market conservatism. It shouldn't come as a surprise that those in power are doing their best to get more students enrolled in private school. Indoctrinating them into the cult of capitalism while they're young is the only way they can produce more pro-corporate voters. Heck, judging by what we've seen recently, it wouldn't come as a surprise to see public schools go the same way. The previous administration even suggested the creation of a commission for patriotic education, a slate of pro-America, capitalist, imperialist propaganda. This disturbing trend towards privatization and capitalist indoctrination aside, what's perhaps the bigger problem with American education is the fact that the entire system is simply outdated. Remember the Massachusetts School Board? The one established in 1837? Well, that's when the standards for education were established. The state
1837, that was a long time ago. But then, as someone said earlier, the later Board of Education was headed by John D. Rockefeller, literally like the head finance capitalist, the head imperialist capitalist of the U.S. ruling class. Someone asked, what is your area of study, if I might ask? Geopolitics, I would say, global politics, and I could say economics, but I would say not quite. I would say geopolitical economics, the way that economics influences and affects global politics, is like one of my main research focuses. I got my bachelor's in politics in college and studied as much economics as I can, but I don't have any majors or minors or degrees in economics, although politics and economics overlap a lot. And then now I'm getting a graduate degree in healthcare administration. So I would say my research focuses are geopolitics and healthcare administration. But it's always interesting to learn how, fields like education and even educational psychology are interrelated to my fields of study. And, you see a lot of parallels in the privatization of the education system and the privatization of our healthcare system.
Stated goal was to educate young people. But if you take a look at how school was and is structured, it becomes more clear what education was actually for. Like it is today, the school day was strictly regimented. Teachers expected absolute obedience. The bell instructed students when the day began and ended, and punishment was doled out for any perceived non-compliance. If the students retained some basic arithmetic, great. But the real goal was to produce obedient, servile workers for the factories of the Industrial Revolution. Step onto a factory floor and what's expected? Obedience, focus, the ability to follow instructions for hours on end. The day even began and ended with a bell. School was then and remains today an instrument to instill discipline, to mass produce agreeable little cogs for the industrial machine. The standardization of schooling ensured these cogs were nice and uniform, easily replaceable and expendable. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, factory labor is no longer the prime driver of the economy. Companies still need workers, but they demand a new set of skills. Young people entering the workforce are expected to be able to be flexible, creative, and on call at unreasonable hours. Even from a capitalist perspective, modern-day schooling does not adequately prepare our students for the real world. Of course, preparing students for a lifetime of servitude should not be the goal of a good education. Let's examine the main issues in regards to outdatedness. Which of these two hypothetical classes sounds more applicable to real life, Latin or home economics? Guess which one is more commonly taught. If the goal of school is to prepare kids for the real world as we're meant to believe, we are doing our students a great disservice. Why don't we teach home economics classes? Why don't we teach high schoolers how to file taxes? What about useful things like basic first aid? We simply don't teach applicable skills. Then there's the fact that school curriculum just hasn't kept pace with advancements in modern technology. Basic computer classes are offered as a...
And the other thing that, you know, I've made a lot of videos about this and they haven't gone like viral or anything, you know, so it's not a point that people have latched onto, but I think it's an important one. They teach you facts in the American education system in isolation, right? They don't teach you philosophy. They don't have you think about how to think, right? And how to observe material reality. You know, and they don't have you, they'll teach you the scientific method maybe, but they won't tell you, you know, why or how the scientific method was developed, or its purpose or the main thinkers behind it. Or they won't talk about materialist philosophy. They mostly just teach you facts in isolation. They'll teach you what the scientific method is, but not its historical development, not the philosophical argumentation behind it. Which, when you look at facts in isolation, right, like that, when you're not looking at, you know, the totality of the system, when you're not analyzing different aspects of society and the economy in their interrelation, which is how they exist in reality and how they operate in reality, you're looking at them in isolation and it's boring, right? Because you're not really interpreting reality. You're not really coming to understand the material world. You're coming to understand isolated facts about the material world, you know, the Pythagorean theorem, or how to solve an algebraic equation, or, you know, the scientific method in isolation. But unless you're reading philosophy, or reading like what our friend here just brought up, Hegel, it's hard to see the purpose of all this information, right? It's hard to know, or hard to really realize the importance of studying and observing the world and coming to understand the world, and, you know, reading what Lenin calls the treasures of humanity, all the important books written throughout history, and all the scientific advancements and advancements in historical understanding that have come about throughout history. When you're looking at facts in isolation, right? When you're looking at historical events in isolation, when you're looking at the development of human societies through this great man of history fallacy, right? When you read Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti, which uses Marx's dialectical materialist method to look at World War II and the economic developments and material conditions that created World War II and the rise of fascism, it's very, very, very interesting, because you can see, you know, how developments in the class struggle are directly related to developments in politics, right? So it's not just that there was this crazy super genius, evil man, Hitler, who came to power, and he didn't like this other dictator, really tough, gruff communist guy, Stalin, in the East. So he tried to take over Stalin, as well as take over FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the US, and Churchill in the UK, and these great men of history, these great leaders, just battled it out at the helm of their country, right? That's kind of how we're taught things in the neoliberal education system. But when you read Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, you see that, you know, the economic destitution enforced on Germany after World War I was largely what led to the rise of Hitler and eventually World War II. Because Germany had to pay reparations to the victorious imperialist countries after World War I, it left their people in a destitute economic situation, right? And so as people started turning to communism, or they started turning to reactionary, violent, fascistic ideologies promoted by demagogues like Hitler, and they battled it out, and the Social Democrats and the capitalists and the liberals ended up siding with the fascists, doing things like assassinating communist leader Rosa Luxemburg and allowing Hitler and fascism to come to power, which led to World War II. So when you see the development of economic conditions, it makes a lot more sense, right? It helps you actually understand reality and why these insane historical events like World War I and World War II happened, rather than just looking at them in isolation and being like, wow, humanity sure is evil. We sure killed a lot of each other. Who knows why this happens, though? It must just be because humans are bad. not because of developments in the economy and developments within capitalism and production. I mean, if we go back even further, Lenin talks about World War I as the great imperialist war. You have all these imperialist capitalist countries where capitalism has developed and transformed into its monopoly stage in a lot of cases, who are super exploiting places in the global south. The US captures a bunch of Latin American colonies during the Spanish-American War at the beginning of the 20th century. The UK, Britain, starts capturing a bunch of colonies in Africa, so they can super exploit these areas. The US and Central America as well. And you have the development of this new stage of capitalism called imperialism. Now, World War I happens when all of these countries are dragged into a battle over the colonies. They're fighting each other over these colonies, over these plots of land with resources and labor that they can super exploit for super profits, for surplus value. Obviously, Germany is the loser of this. Germany has to pay reparations, leads to the rise of fascism. The rest is history, and the whole thing's history. But you see how class developments, right, and developments of material conditions, the development of the productive base of society led to all these crazy political events and helps us explain these things, right? And it's a lot more interesting and a lot more fun to learn about, and a lot more valuable when you see things in their interconnection like this, right? When you're not looking at World War I and World War II in isolation, or maybe, just looking at a few years of historical development that led to them, but rather looking at the changing material conditions that allowed it and the changes in the productive base, the changes in capitalism that incentivized these countries to go to war. So that's why I think Hegel's really great and everyone should read Hegel. I know I say Hegel with a Midwestern Wisconsinite accent, but it helps you see the interrelation of things. It helps you see that, World War I and World War II were great imperialist wars. But we can't understand them in isolation, right? We have to understand them in their interrelation, especially to the productive base of society, right? Especially in their interrelation to the relations of production, the capitalist relations of production, and the fact that they stemmed from the desire for capitalist accumulation and the desire to control more markets and accumulate more wealth and capital and control more of the world. That's what led these countries to be drawn into these hyper-violent wars where they sent their working classes to fight and die. Other than the Soviet Union in World War II, of course, they were defending themselves. Well, I guess all the Allied powers in World War II were acting in self-defense and acting for the good of humanity ultimately. But yeah, it's a lot more interesting to learn about these things in their interconnection, and learn about World War I and World War II as part of the capitalist totality, right? As part of the totality of society that we're trying to analyze. A totality is made up of a bunch of different interrelated parts, a bunch of different interrelated particulars. And World War I and World War II are time periods or parts, or results of the developments of capitalism over years and years and years, material developments that we can study and see how they're interrelated to one another, and see how developments in economics are related to developments in politics. So this is probably the last question I'll answer. I'll check the chat one more time before I head to sleep here, but trying to find my Hegel. How is Hegel going? Just asking because you said a few months ago you were reading his work, and I find him impenetrable. Yeah, Hegel. Reading Hegel is how I came up with that idea that education and the education system would be more interesting and get kids more interested in learning if they taught facts in their interrelation, right? If they taught philosophy and taught kids how to think and how to think critically, rather than just teaching them, various facts in isolation, or by teaching about particulars rather than the totality and the interrelation of different particulars. So that's an idea I got from Hegel, because that's a lot of what Hegel writes about. And it depends on what you're reading. If you find his phenomenology of spirit to be impenetrable, or the science of logic, like, that makes perfect sense. I mean, those books are pretty hard to just pick up and read without a guide. So, make sure you're using like various lectures on Hegel. You can use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's pretty good. It's all edited by, an expert in that field. Oh, thank you for the super chat. I'll definitely answer that question after I cover this one. Really appreciate that, Tusker. Thanks for the $5. But if you're having trouble with the phenomenology or science of logic, read this: Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Volume 1. This is where he gives lectures on his dialectic and on his method of analysis and on the development of human thought over time, which he looks at almost in a materialist way, right? Like, Hegel's almost a proto-materialist. He approaches materialism, dialectical and historical materialism, without reaching it, without penetrating it, without truly grasping it, right? Because he talks about the development of human thought over time, and how our understanding develops, and how different material conditions in different places can lead to the development of different kinds of human thought, different strands of thought, and different developments in science and philosophy and whatever else. So, he gets close to historical materialism without reaching it, but this is the best thing to read when you're starting out, right? This is a lot more comprehensible than the phenomenology or science of logic right off the bat, if you combine it with, reading guides and helpful lectures. But make sure you get Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy. Otherwise, you're going to be really upset when Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of History shows up, and then your friend Carlos texts you after you send him a picture of it, really excited to read it, and he's going to say, that's the wrong book, bro. You have to get Lectures on the History of Philosophy, not Lectures on the Philosophy of History, although Lectures on the Philosophy of History is also apparently a good book. I don't know, I haven't read it. But I haven't been reading Hegel for a while because, like I said, I've been finishing Volume 2. I want to finish Volume 2, finish the Grundrisse, so really finish the core economic works of Marx, eventually dive into Volume 3, and then I'll go back to Hegel. Have you seen the documentary series called Roses Have Thorns? It's a really good deep dive into the history of the Ukraine Civil War. Oh, I have not. Is that Igor Lopatanok? I wonder if it's the same person who made Ukraine on Fire. What's it called? Roses Have Thorns is a good name because you had the Revolution of Roses in East Europe, and oftentimes U.S. color revolutions are like named after flowers or named after things that make them sound cool and revolutionary and give the aesthetic of being progressive and radical and left-wing, like the Revolution of Roses, which was that Ukraine or Georgia? That was in Georgia, but U.S.-backed color revolution. So I like the name of the documentary, but I have not seen it. I'm sure if I Google it, it'll be a bunch of Western sources calling it Putin propaganda, but it was 2008. That can't be right. Here we go, Euromaidan in Crimea. This looks really interesting. Who produced this? I don't know. I can't figure it out. I'm sure it says if you watch it, but this looks really interesting. I'll throw the link in the chat for people who are interested. I really like Ukraine on Fire, which is directed by a guy named Igor Lopatanok, and I know he was going to do more. He was planning on doing another movie or two on this, which were Amazon Video and Hulu and a bunch of these Western corporations controlled by oligarchs or Silicon Valley oligarchs said they weren't going to allow it on their platform, which is hilarious, considering that Russia is constantly being accused of controlling our media and censoring freedom of speech and spreading propaganda. The oligarchs, the ruling class of our society, who control the platforms that allow for speech, facilitate speech, and control the production of information to only allow certain propaganda to get out. But thank you for the super chat, by the way, Tusker, and for recommending this. It looks interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. Jenny Lynn said it's really good and it's hard to find because of YouTube search results and algorithms. For sure, it's crazy how censored Ukraine on Fire was, and it surprised me at first because Oliver Stone is such a popular director, right? He's like a mainstream director who did movies like Platoon that are pretty famous and are considered like part of American cinematic history. But now if you search like Ukraine on Fire, all that shows up. I mean, you can see this, but then there's a block in front of it. And it's constant. It's been removed before, and then every time you search Ukraine on Fire, this ethno-nationalist Nazi propaganda from Netflix also pops up, calling the Euromaidan coup a beautiful freedom revolution. Great stream. Thank you so much, Edwin Vargas. Thank you so much for the $10 super chat. Really appreciate that support. Yeah. Appreciate that. Just so y'all know, if you don't want to leave super chats, you can become a member on YouTube now. Or I mean, if you want some more benefits for your super chats, I really, really appreciate it, of course. And I'll always answer your super chat questions. And, these are one of the main ways that we fund our project. The YouTube super chats are, but you can now also become a YouTube member. And if you become a $10 YouTube member, you get a free copy, not a free copy, but a copy of the Journal of American Socialist Studies ebook, just like you do for being a $10 Patreon supporter. So, if you're going to send a $10 super chat, you might as well become a $10 member at some point and get yourself a copy of the Journal of American Socialist Studies 1 and 2. But as you can probably hear in my voice, friends, I'm falling asleep. It's 1:13 a.m. over here. I did 8 hours of homework today, and my brain has had it. It's fried. Thank you all for hanging out with me today. It's been a great stream. Thank you to all the super chatters for the support. Thank you for making our projects possible. Shout out to Noah, who's in Philadelphia right now, meeting with another Marxist organization whose name is slipping my mind right now because it's 1 a.m. and I'm about to pass out. But go look that up on our Twitter. Give Noah your support. Yeah, I'll see you all later. Much love. Oh yeah, read my article on MidwesternMarx.com about postmodernism and neoclassical economics. All right, bye everyone. Love you.